The snow fell in thick, swirling gusts that obscured the horizon and turned the world a hushed gray. Atop the ramparts of Castle Black, Jon Snow stood wrapped in a heavy black cloak, the wind lashing at his dark hair. There was a new tension in the air, one that went beyond the ragged threats lurking beyond the wall. Stannis Baratheon, the self-declared king of the Seven Kingdoms, had come to the north with an army of sellswords, bannermen, and a red priestess whispering of destiny. The north was a place of old gods and older loyalties, and Stannis's determination to claim Winterfell by force, for the sake of his crown, had started to wear on those who knew the north best. Jon Snow felt it in the stiffening of men's shoulders, in the wary glances from the few northern lords who had come to parley or pledge what little support they could spare. He felt it in the way the free folk, newly arrived south of the wall, eyed the Baratheon soldiers with suspicion that ran as deep as the endless winter nights. He felt it most keenly in his own heart, which warred with the oaths he had sworn as a brother of the Night's Watch and the secrets hidden in his blood. Duty bound him, but something else, older and more potent, kept whispering in his ears, that the North belonged to the Starks, and he was one of them, whether he bore their name or not. The frost-laden boards of the courtyard creaked underfoot as Jon descended from the battlements. He made his way toward the King's Tower, a temporary structure refitted for Stannis's royal presence. Each step was a struggle to keep from slipping, though the bruising chill hardly registered as anything more than a persistent ache. When he reached the tower's entrance, he was greeted by two guards wearing the crowned stag sigil of House Baratheon. They offered no words, only a cursory nod that Jon returned with equal restraint. Inside, the air was marginally warmer, though not by much. Torches flickered against the stone walls, their flames dancing in the gusts that managed to sneak through every gap and fissure in the old masonry. The corridor wound sharply to the left, leading to a modest audience chamber. Jon found Stannis behind a table covered with maps of the north. The king in the narrow sea wore a heavy cloak trimmed with white fur, bought from some northern trapper or flayed from an animal. Jon couldn't say for certain. Stannis had already lost much to the winter winds. His face was lean and gaunt, his temples streaked with white, and his eyes were lit by a fanatical intensity. Melisandre stood behind him like a red shadow. Her hair gleamed like fire in the dim torchlight, and her ruby necklace pulsed with a low, rhythmic glow. Jon had never liked the way she studied him, like he was some puzzle whose final shape she alone could see. To their right stood Ser Davos Seaworth, expression tight-lipped and weary. The Onion Knight had told Jon once that he did not agree with every one of his king's decisions, but duty compelled him forward. This day, as on most days, Davos's countenance suggested he carried the weight of the entire realm on his shoulders. Stannis jabbed his gloved finger at the map. House Glover still withholds their banners. House Mormont is reluctant. House Serwyn is no friend to the Boltons, but they do not trust my cause. They say they trust the Starks. If only there were a Stark among you, he said, his eyes flicking to Jon with faint disapproval. Jon pressed his lips tight. The North yearned for a Stark, he knew that well enough. Stannis had dangled the possibility before him. Legitimization, the name of Stark, the title of Lord of Winterfell. It had been tempting as the sweetest honeyed wine, but Jon had refused, remaining true, at least outwardly, to his vows as a man of the Night's Watch. Yet things had changed in the days since. Stannis had grown more desperate, more ruthless. Rumors abounded that he had taken savage retribution against some lesser clans who refused to send men. That was not how one won the hearts of Northerners, but the rightful king seemed unconcerned with such nuance. "My lord," Jon said, letting the formal address slip from his lips. He knew it appeased Stannis's sense of majesty. "I ask you again to consider a less violent means of gathering support." "Violent," Stannis repeated, his lips pressed in a tight line, "is a word used by those who do not understand necessity. The Boltons hold Winterfell, which was once the seat of House Stark. They were traitors to the crown, flaying men, betraying the North. I will not apologize for ensuring the rightful seat is taken from usurpers." Jon glanced at Melisandre. Her face was unreadable. She merely offered him one of her distant, knowing smiles. "Winterfell does not belong to the Boltons," she said, "and when the fires are lit, we shall see who is truly chosen by Lawler." That name of her foreign god hung in the cold air for a moment. Jon fought to keep his composure. The memory of the Night King and his whites beyond the wall was never far from his mind. Whatever difference of religion or ambition existed here, he knew there was a greater threat on the horizon. Must it be done so quickly? Jon pressed. "The winter is harsh, the roads are impassable. Your men will freeze and starve before they reach Winterfell, and the Boltons will make short work of an army too ragged to fight at full strength." Stannis scowled, his knuckles whitening on the edge of the table. "I will not wait. My claim must be enforced. If the North will not bend the knee willingly, they will be made to do so. And if that means cutting down a few more lords who think they're above fealty to the rightful king, so be it." Jon felt a flash of anger burning in his chest. He thought of the small folk, the families and children, the old men and women of the North. They had been through so much already. Wars, false kings, invaders. The land was wounded and winter had come. The idea of forcibly subduing the very people Stannis wished to rule seemed a reckless path to destruction. "How many more, Your Grace?" Jon asked, struggling to keep his voice measured. "How many lords will you kill? How many men and women will freeze in the snow before the North is at peace?" Stannis's mouth twitched. Melisandre's red eyes glowed with an almost otherworldly light. Davos cast a nervous glance at Jon, silently warning him not to overstep. But Jon could not contain the storm rising within him. Stannis's voice dropped low, almost a growl. "You grow bold in your defiance. You dare question the will of your king, Snow? I recall you refusing my offer to make you Jon Stark. Yet you stand here lecturing me as if you were Lord of Winterfell all the same." Jon bowed his head, though it was hardly in supplication. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. "You are my king," he said quietly, "but I won't stand by and watch the North burned and battered into submission. Not again." "Again? As if I have done this before." Stannis slammed his fist on the table, rattling the map markers. "I am not the Lannisters, nor am I the Boltons. This war is righteous. There is only one war that matters, and that war is for the living. If the North does not understand that I am the only king who will face the coming darkness, then they are fools." Jon thought of the crypts beneath Winterfell, of his father's statue, of the stories he had heard as a boy, and how each tale conjured an image of a Stark who would do anything to protect their people. He thought of Robb, who was crowned king in the North and died for his cause. The name Stark was a mantle heavier than any crown, yet it seemed to rest uneasy on Stannis's ambitions. "I will speak to the lords again," Jon offered, though his words felt hollow. "I'll try to reason with them, Your Grace. But remember that the North will not bend easily." Stannis said nothing more. His gaze flicked to Melisandre, and then to Davos, who nodded his agreement. The tension simmered, but for now it abated. Jon was free to leave. He left the king's tower swiftly, his breath coming in clouds of mist. Once he was in the courtyard again, he leaned against the cold stone wall, letting the biting wind chill his flushed face. He did not know how long he could hold his tongue, how many times he could watch Stannis vow to run roughshod over the North. Jon cared about the safety of the people more than any dream of ruling, more than any dream of a crown. Yet the notion kept pressing into his mind. The North needed leadership, not conquest. He recalled how Stannis's attempts to coerce loyalty from northern houses had led to forced tithes, threatened executions, and a kind of fear that lingered more strongly day after day. Even the most loyal lords to House Stark found themselves at odds with this man who named himself king, who demanded their fealty while giving them no reason to trust him beyond the words, "It is my right." Jon turned, eyes narrowing as he observed the courtyard. A few Baratheon guards huddled near braziers, warming their hands. Some free folk strode across the yard, exchanging uneasy glances with the castle's newest inhabitants. One figure in the corner of the yard caught his eye. Tormund Giantsbane, big and ruddy-cheeked, leaning against a post with a heavy cloak wrapped around his broad shoulders. Jon approached him, and Tormund inclined his head. Is the king spitting flames again? Or is he simply letting that red woman do it for him? Jon smiled wryly. Stannis is determined. More determined than ever. Tormund's mirth faded. Determined to lead us all into an early grave, if you ask me. We have dead men beyond the wall, Jon Snow. Winter's here, and it's going to make corpses of us all if we're not careful. He paused, giving a meaningful glance around. Your black brothers and these steel-crowned idiots from the south. None of them see it like we do. The free folk follow you because you showed them a path that wasn't all blood and blades. But this Stannis, he's got the eyes of a man who'd burn half the world to rule the other half. Jon inhaled sharply. The crisp air was laced with the scent of pine and cold stone. We have to keep the watch out of this. Our vows, Tormund snorted. Vows? Your vow is to protect the realm, isn't it? Stannis wants to break it apart. Sounds like you might have to decide which vow is more important. That comment struck a chord too close to home. Jon gave a weary nod. I'll do what I must. For the next few days, Castle Black remained a cauldron of tension. Stannis's men drilled in the yard, battered by wind and snow, preparing for a march on Winterfell. Word reached them that the Boltons were girding for war as well, and that Lord Roose Bolton had sent out riders to gather more support from reluctant vassals. The question of who the North would truly follow had grown more complicated. Melisandre spoke ominous portents each evening. She claimed she saw visions in her fires, of a great battle in the snow, of banners burning, of a sword alight with fire. Many began whispering that Stannis would fulfill some prophecy she called Azor Ahai Reborn, that he would be the warrior to drive back the darkness. Yet others, including many of the northern men, scoffed quietly at such foreign mysticism. Jon spent his days trying to broker small alliances. He wrote letters to House Mormont, House Glover, House Serwyn, House Reed, even to the Hill clans, hoping to stave off bloodshed. But each Raven's return brought news that trust in Stannis was slipping. The Northern Lords did not want the Boltons to remain, but they also did not trust Stannis's heavy-handed approach. When Jon confronted Stannis with these responses, the king's anger only grew. Let them learn the cost of defiance, he snapped, throwing one letter into the flames. Once I've taken Winterfell from the Boltons, they will see reason. But would the North kneel after more bloodshed? Jon doubted it, and each day that doubt weighed more heavily on his shoulders. Melisandre watched him with a curious intensity, as though she saw some hidden shape beneath his skin. One night, Jon was summoned to Stannis's private chamber. He found the king seated before a meager fire. Melisandre stood behind his chair, her eyes flickering in the low light. The room smelled of cold ash and a faint whiff of incense. Stannis lifted his gaze, beckoning Jon closer. The time has come for bold action, he said. We march on Winterfell at daybreak. Jon's heart sank. He hadn't expected it so soon. Your Grace, your men aren't prepared. The road is blocked by snow, and you don't have enough supplies. Marching now could spell disaster. Stannis's eyes blazed. You think I haven't considered that? If I delay further, the Boltons will strengthen their hold. Their support among minor houses grows each day, either through intimidation or bribes. The North is fractious. It needs a strong hand to guide it. Jon's breath came shallow, but he steadied himself. If you do this, you will force every northern house to make a choice. And if they choose poorly or defy you, you'll make them bleed. That isn't how you win the North. Melisandre spoke, her voice soft and echoing. The fires do not lie, Lord Commander. I have seen a vision of Winterfell's walls caked in ice, its courtyards drenched in blood, and a sword of fire shining amidst the darkness. This is our time. Jon looked between them, stricken by how little they understood the land they meant to conquer. The true threat is the White Walkers, he said, voice calm but urgent. We can't afford to lose men fighting a war in the snow while the army of the dead gathers. Unite the North, do not force it. If we stand as one, we might stand a chance. If we're divided, the others will sweep across us all. Stannis's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. I am king. The North must bend the knee. Once Winterfell is mine, I can turn my attention to this threat you speak of. Until then, I cannot let these traitors remain in open defiance. There was no changing his mind, Jon realized. The tension in his gut felt like a knot of ice twisting slowly. Stannis had declared his course, and the blood would spill. The only question was how much. Stannis went on. I want you to ride with us. Lead a contingent of the free folk if you must. Show the North that even the wildlings follow the king's command. That will force the naysayers to realize their futility. And if you do so, I will revisit my offer of legitimization. Jon stiffened. He heard the subtext of the request. If you do not ride with me, you will be against me. I cannot involve the Night's Watch, he said. You know our vows, your grace. We do not take sides in the wars of the realm. Yet you took sides in letting the wildlings through the wall, Stannis retorted. You took sides when you executed Janos Slynt. You are the Lord Commander, but you bend the rules when it suits your conscience. Jon felt a flush of anger. I did what was necessary for the good of the realm, not for personal gain. Stannis rose from his chair, the firelight casting a stark shadow across his face. And I am telling you what is necessary for the good of the realm. The realm needs a strong king to unite it, to fight back against these others you claim are coming. Lend me the free folk's strength, and I will ensure a place for them in the new order. Refuse, and do not be surprised when the North, in its ignorance, rejects your pleas for unity. For a moment, Jon could only stare. Melisandre's presence loomed, a living embodiment of the foreign god's flames. You leave me little choice, Jon said bitterly. But I cannot speak for all free folk. They follow Tormund, and they will only fight if they believe it's in their interest. Stannis nodded curtly. Then speak to them. Convince them. Their interest lies in not being slaughtered by the boltons if the tide of battle turns. Jon left the chamber with a sense of dread that gnawed at him. He spoke to Tormund later that night, explaining Stannis's ultimatum. Tormund spat on the ground. I followed you this far, Jon Snow, because you have a good heart and a sharp mind. But now you want me to follow this southerner into a fight that might kill thousands of my people? Why in the blasted hells would I do that? Jon rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion tugging at every fiber. Because if we don't, Stannis might turn on us. The Boltons will definitely turn on us. And if we're to have a chance against the White Walkers, we need the North united, whether it's behind Stannis or not. Until another Stark can claim Winterfell, this is our best shot. Tormund studied him, brow furrowed. You're the only Stark these people see, Jon Snow. Even if you won't wear the name, your blood is as close to Ned Stark's as any living soul now. Jon felt a flash of sorrow at the memory of his father. I have no right to that name. My vows. Your vows won't keep the others at bay, Tormund growled. Your vows won't keep your people safe. Jon sighed. I know, but for now we bide our time. If Stannis is truly unstoppable, we might have to stand aside. I'm not asking the free folk to fight for him, but just not to fight against him. For now, the decision was made, albeit reluctantly. Tormund and many of the free folk would not actively march with Stannis, but they wouldn't hamper his forces either. Stannis was displeased, but grudgingly accepted that half cooperation was better than outright denial. 2 days later, the army set out. It was a miserable affair, trudging through knee-deep snowdrifts, battered by freezing winds. Stannis's men cursed and spat, forging onward toward the distant fortress of Winterfell. Jon remained at Castle Black, though he dispatched a small scout party of free folk to watch the roads, to see if the Boltons would move against Stannis in open battle or attempt to stall him through sabotage. The days dragged on, and ravens brought bleak news. Stannis's force was stalled by a blizzard of unnatural ferocity. Some whispered Melisandre had foreseen it and tried to warn the king, but Stannis had pressed onward anyway. Food grew scarce. Men deserted. Reports of brutal punishments for deserters surfaced, painting Stannis's leadership in ever darker hues. When a battered, half-frozen scout stumbled through the gates of Castle Black to deliver his tidings, Jon felt the weight of dread settle in his stomach. Stannis was camped near a small crofters' village miles from Winterfell. Supplies were gone. Morale was in tatters. The boltons were prepared for a siege, waiting comfortably behind Winterfell's walls. Night fell, and Jon found himself in the castle's library, poring over old texts about the North, about Stark lineage, about the Wars of the Roses in an ancient time, though the details were incomplete. He was searching for some crumb of wisdom, some strategy that would prevent further destruction. But each candle's flickering flame only revealed more uncertainty. It was then that Melisandre appeared, silent as a wraith. She glided across the stone floor, the ruby at her throat casting dancing shadows on the shelves. "You are troubled," she said softly, her voice echoing in the stillness. Jon closed the tome he'd been reading. Stannis' campaign is failing. The North is devouring him. If he persists, it won't be the boltons that undo him, but the land itself. Her red eyes glowed. Then perhaps this is what the Lord of Light intends. Jon bristled. "I thought you supported him, believed him to be Azor Ahai reborn." Melisandre tilted her head. "He carries a part of the prophecy. The sword he wields is named Lightbringer, though it has not truly been Ted in the fires that matter. Yet the fires have shown me another. A man cloaked in darkness, reborn amidst salt and smoke. One who stands in the snow." Her gaze was fixed upon Jon. He tried to control his features, but a prickle of unease crept across his skin. "I don't believe in your gods. I believe in what I can see." She smiled. "Then perhaps you will see soon enough." With that cryptic statement, she departed, leaving Jon in a labyrinth of questions. Word came that Stannis had made a fateful decision, to move his army again, to try to encircle Winterfell from a different angle. Men were freezing by the dozens. Horses died, carting what supplies remained. Still, he pressed on, sure that the North could be subdued. Jon's horror grew with each raven's note. At last, he could bear it no longer. He donned his thickest cloak, gathered a small entourage, Tormund among them, and set out for the crofters' village with fresh supplies, determined to talk sense into Stannis one last time. Perhaps together, they could plan a more prudent approach, or at least keep the men alive until the snows abated. They traveled for days in the swirling, featureless drifts, each night huddling around meager fires while the wind howled outside their tents. At last, the columns of smoke rising against the gray sky hinted at Stannis' encampment. The place was little more than a cluster of huts around a small frozen lake, but it teemed with misery. Ragged tents, starved horses, men with frostbitten fingers and despairing eyes. Jon's arrival stirred a ripple of murmurs among the soldiers. Some scowled, believing he had abandoned them earlier. Others rushed to him, begging for food or a place by a warm fire. Jon directed his small supply train to distribute what they could, even as he worried it was but a drop of relief in an ocean of suffering. He found Stannis in one of the sturdier huts, surrounded by braziers and furs. The king's face was gaunt, the hollows of his cheeks casting deep shadows. Melisandre was there, too, and Ser Davos, whose eyes were bloodshot with worry. Jon wasted no time. "Your Grace, you must turn back. I brought what supplies I could, but we cannot reach Winterfell in this storm. Your men are dying by the dozens." Stannis' jaw clenched. "Turn back? Then the boltons win. The North remains under the banner of flayed men." Melisandre's gaze flicked to Jon, her expression unreadable. "The Lord of Light's path is seldom easy." "Easy?" Jon hissed, anger finally boiling over. "Dying in a blizzard isn't a matter of difficulty. It's madness." Stannis pushed himself upright. "Mind your tone, Snow. I am still your king." Jon's knuckles twitched at his sides. "My king? You have done nothing but alienate the Northerners you wish to rule. You freeze them, starve them, punish them for desertions that are bred by desperation. You think you can lead them when you treat them like cattle?" Stannis' eyes blazed, and for a moment, Jon wondered if the man would draw his sword. Davos stepped between them, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We're all tired, cold, and hungry. Let us not fight each other." "Jon, is there a middle way?" Jon took a breath, forcing himself to steady. "Fall back to Castle Black. Regroup. Wait out the worst of the storms. If the Boltons come out to attack, we can face them on better ground. If not, we gather more supplies. Coordinate with northern lords who might be swayed by a more measured approach." Stannis looked at the pathetic brazier flame as if searching for an omen. Melisandre stood silent, but a tension in her posture suggested she knew how dire the situation was. Davos, for his part, nodded thoughtfully. "A retreat might save lives," Davos said softly. "It might even earn us a measure of goodwill if we do not force the Northerners to feed a starving army. We could do as Jon suggests, try to win hearts rather than burn them." Stannis's mouth twisted, the lines on his face deepening. "This is not what I wanted." Jon stepped closer. "What you want may not matter. Winter is here, and the White Walkers are not a distant rumor. We need the North strong and united if we stand any chance at all. Going forward with this doomed campaign does nothing but weaken us." Stannis shut his eyes for a moment. Jon saw the man's struggle etched plainly in his posture, as though every muscle in his body resisted the idea of turning back from a challenge. Then, at last, his shoulders slackened. "Very well," he said, voice low. "We will prepare to move back to Castle Black. You will help me ensure the men stay disciplined. If the Boltons march after us, we will destroy them on the road." Relief coursed through Jon. This was the best outcome he could have hoped for in these dire circumstances. "I will do all I can," he said, ignoring the fact that he was once more stepping far beyond the bounds of his vows. But as fate would have it, the decision to march back came too late. A raven arrived the next morning bearing the Bolton sigil and a chilling message. The Boltons were coming. Roose Bolton had gathered his forces, and Ramsay Bolton led a vanguard that was already on its way, eager to crush the weakened army of Stannis. Surrender was demanded, or every man in Stannis's camp would be flayed. Jon read the letter with grim disgust. The words reeked of Ramsay's cruelty. Stannis's men, half frozen as they were, erupted in anger at the threat. Retreat became impossible, for the Boltons would be upon them soon. They had no choice now but to stand and fight, or else scatter into the snow. 2 nights later, under a pale moon obscured by ragged clouds, the first Bolton scouts appeared. Arrows hissed through the air, striking tents and sending men running for cover. Jon realized they had no advantage of high ground or strong walls. They were in a poor position, but the battle had come, whether they willed it or not. Stannis donned his armor, the plate adorned with the crowned stag. Jon, arrayed in his own black leathers and cloak, stood beside him for a moment of uneasy silence. The men around them readied spears and swords, eyes hollow with hunger and fear. Tormund and his free folk stood off to one side, uncertain if they should fight for the Southern King or simply defend themselves. When the Bolton forces finally crashed into Stannis's ragged lines, it was a scene of chaos and blood in the swirling snow. Jon fought like a man possessed, his sword slashing through Bolton men even as he tried to keep track of allies in the maelstrom. The wind carried the screams of wounded horses, the clash of steel, the frantic shouts of commands that were lost in the din. Stannis, for his part, fought with grim determination. Melisandre stood at a distance, chanting prayers to her Lord of Light. Whether it helped or not, Jon could not say. Davos led a contingent on the left flank, trying to hold the line against a wave of Bolton pikemen. Tormund's free folk, spurred by their own sense of loyalty to Jon if not to Stannis, finally joined the fray when it looked as though the Bolton cavalry would encircle them. Despite the fearsome resistance, the Boltons' numbers were overwhelming. They pressed closer, driving men back against the frozen lake. Through the white haze, Jon saw the flayed man banners snapping in the wind, as though mocking them. He lost count of how many times he narrowly avoided an axe or a spear. His arms ached with fatigue, and frost clung to his brows. Then came a moment of terrifying clarity. Ramsay Bolton himself, astride a towering black warhorse, leading a fresh wave of men. He loosed arrow after arrow from his bow, grinning all the while. A few found their mark among Stannis's men, toppling them into the snow where they bled out in silent agony. Jon desperately fought his way toward Ramsay, hoping to end the sadist's life before more could die. But a sudden rush of Bolton soldiers blocked him, and he lost sight of the bastard of House Bolton. Meanwhile, Stannis pushed forward on foot, hacking through the press of pikes and shields, determined to reach the Bolton standard. In the swirling white confusion, Jon caught a glimpse of Melisandre's red cloak, the ruby at her throat glowing with fierce light. The Red Woman's chant rose above the battle, an eerie litany that seemed to make the flames of the scattered torches dance higher. For a moment, Jon saw a reflection of fire in her eyes, a vision of something terrible and grand. Despair swelled as more of Stannis's men fell. The Bolton ranks seemed endless, their armor better, their stamina bolstered by a warm castle and ample supplies. Jon was certain they were about to be routed entirely, forced into a last stand at the village's edge. But then a great cry went up from the right flank. Through the gloom, Jon saw a line of horsemen barreling into the Bolton foot soldiers. At first, he feared it was a second wave of Bolton cavalry. But no, it was a motley collection of Northmen, bearing the sigils of Cerwyn, Hornwood, and Mormont. They slammed into the Boltons with furious determination, breaking their formation and sending men scattering. Why had they come? Had they changed their minds about Stannis? Or was this simply an opportunity to strike at the hated Boltons? Jon didn't know, but their timing was a miracle. The Bolton force, taken by surprise, began to crumble at the edges. Ramsay himself was forced to retreat, cursing and screaming at his men to hold formation. Seizing the moment, Stannis surged forward. Jon followed, sword clashing against steel. Tormund's war cries thundered across the ice. The forest of pikes in front of them collapsed into a panicked rout, men slipping on bloody, slick snow. And for one bright moment it seemed as though victory, unthinkable just moments before, might be within reach. Then, from the corner of his eye, Jon saw Ramsay draw a fresh arrow and aim at Stannis, who had foolishly separated from his main guard in the heat of battle. Jon's heart lurched. He lunged, hoping to intercept, but was tackled by a Bolton soldier. By the time he shoved the man off and rolled to his feet, the arrow was flying. With uncanny speed, Stannis brought his sword up. The arrow deflected off the steel, grazing his breastplate. Ramsay spat a curse, his eyes narrowing in fury. He knocked another arrow, but Tormund's booming war cry distracted him, forcing him to wheel his horse away. A group of free folk archers let loose a volley that scattered Ramsay's retinue. Jon scrambled to Stannis' side. The king was alive, though his breathing was ragged. His worn face was twisted with desperation. Melisandre appeared from the swirling snow, her robes spattered with blood. Whether her own or someone else's, Jon could not tell. She laid a hand on Stannis' shoulder, and he swayed. "Lightbringer," she whispered, gesturing to his sword. In the half-light of torches and moonlit snow, it seemed to flicker, but not with true fire. "Save your breath," Stannis muttered, raising his voice enough to rally what remained of his men. "Finish them." The battle raged on, but the timely arrival of the other northern houses had turned the tide. Ramsay's men, rattled by the sudden assault, struggled to hold the lines. A savage roar from Tormund signaled a final push that broke the Bolton ranks. Ramsay, seeing his cause lost, rode off in retreat, a handful of loyalists at his back. In the aftermath of that bloody skirmish, the snow was churned pink with gore, and the groans of the wounded were everywhere. Jon hunched over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. His vision spun, but he forced himself to stand and count the survivors. Stannis was still on his feet, supporting himself on his sword. Melisandre hovered near him. Davos had survived, though he limped badly. Those northern houses that had arrived, Cerwyn, Hornwood, Mormont, were few in number, but their presence had been enough. Their leaders gathered around Stannis, though not all of them looked upon him with adoration. They had come to end Bolton rule, and they had done so, or at least driven the Boltons off the field for now. But whether they would kneel to Stannis was a question left unasked in the quiet gloom of victory. Jon spent hours tending to the wounded, coordinating with Tormund, who rounded up free folk survivors. The howling wind grew quieter as the storm began to relent, leaving a stillness that felt heavy with foreboding. In the days that followed, Stannis insisted on pressing forward to Winterfell. With Ramsay's forces scattered, the gates might open without a fight, he reasoned. The surviving northern soldiers, feeling emboldened by the successful battle, agreed to march, though they were cautious. They did not fully trust Stannis, but the chance to finally unseat the Boltons was too tempting to ignore. Jon again tried to counsel patience, but he found his words falling on deaf ears. The men were flushed with victory. They wanted to strike while the Boltons were reeling. So, with wagons full of wounded and meager rations, the battered army trudged onward. Winterfell's gray walls loomed large after days of plodding through snow-covered fields. The approach was eerie, for the gates stood open, as if inviting them. Yet no welcoming party emerged. The courtyard beyond was empty, save for a scattering of footprints in the fresh snow. A sense of unease settled over the men. Could it be a trap? The horns sounded as they entered, echoing off the ancient stones. Jon, riding near the front with Stannis, glanced around at the silent battlements. Something was off. Usually, defenders would man the walls, archers would be positioned on the ramparts, boiling oil or pitch at the ready. But Winterfell stood quietly, like a slumbering beast. They pressed deeper into the fortress, reaching the main courtyard. And there, in a grim display, they found lines of flayed corpses nailed to the walls. Bolton cruelty laid bare. Many men turned away in horror. Even seasoned fighters retched at the sight. Among the dead were Bolton guards, splayed open and left as a message, perhaps from Ramsay himself or perhaps from someone else. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind seeped into Jon's bones. This place was cursed by war and betrayal. It needed to be reclaimed, cleansed. He thought of the ancient Stark kings, how they might have walked these courtyards with heads held high, determined to protect the North from all threats. Could that legacy ever be restored? Stannis dismounted and announced that Winterfell was his. He called upon the men to take control of the stronghold, tear down the Bolton flags, and hoist the crowned stag. A cheer went up, but it was half-hearted. The men were exhausted, half-starved, and haunted by the horrors they'd seen. Still, they did as commanded. The flayed man banners were ripped down, trampled into the snow. A battered Baratheon standard rose over the walls, though the wind threatened to tear it from its pole. In the great hall, a few meager fires were lit. Surviving servants of the castle emerged, trembling, to speak of the Boltons' departure. Ramsay had fled under cover of night, murdering any who dared oppose him. The remnants of the Bolton loyalists who stayed were tortured or killed. Winterfell was a husk, inhabited by ghosts and terrified souls. Stannis took the high seat, the ancient stone chair that once belonged to the Starks. He proclaimed victory, though none felt the triumph. Jon stood off to the side, flanked by Tormund and Davos. Melisandre lingered near Stannis, her eyes gleaming with that peculiar red light. Then the lords of Cerwyn, Hornwood, and Mormont entered the hall. They knelt, not entirely willingly, but they spoke words of fealty to the new occupant of Winterfell. Jon saw how each lord's voice trembled with a mixture of resentment and fear. They had come too far, spent too much blood, to back out now. Better to appear loyal to the king who helped drive out the Boltons. The mood was tense, brittle as old ice. When the lords finished their oaths, Stannis nodded curtly and rose to address them. The North is free of Bolton tyranny. Winterfell is reclaimed in the name of the crown. I stand before you not only as your king, but as the Lord of Light's chosen champion. Those who stand by me will prosper. Those who do not. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Jon felt a flare of anger, remembering the letter he had received from House Mormont, how they said they would only bow to a Stark. He thought of how the northern lords had merely tolerated Stannis' presence because he promised to rid them of the Boltons. Now, with the fortress in his possession, Stannis made clear his intent to rule them with an iron fist. As the hall emptied, Men went about the grim work of disposing of the bodies left by the Boltons. Jon caught up with the Lord of House Mormont. A stern woman named Lyanna Mormont was rumored to be the Lady of Bear Island, but as a child, she had guardians and older relatives who spoke for her. This particular kin was Jarell Mormont, a heavy-set woman with a scar across her face, who had come in Lyanna's stead to fight the Boltons. Jarell eyed Jon with guarded respect. "You are Ned Stark's son?" Jon let out a breath. "His bastard." She looked at him for a moment. "We do not care about your birth in the north. We only care about your blood. If you were to claim Winterfell, Bear Island might kneel. We will not bow to a southern king who knows nothing of our ways." Jon forced himself to look away. "I am of the Night's Watch. I took a vow." Jarell frowned deeply, anger and frustration in her gaze. "And what good is that vow when this king threatens us with the same heavy hand as the Boltons?" Jon had no good answer, so he only said, "The White Walkers are coming. We need to unite, truly unite, before it's too late." She huffed, turning away. "You say that, yet do nothing to stop the king in his madness." A hollow feeling spread in Jon's chest. Where did his duty truly lie? With a vow that bound him to neutrality, or with the people he had always loved, even if they were not supposed to be his to protect? In the days that followed, Stannis tightened his control over Winterfell. He placed guards loyal to him in key positions, demanded hostages from the houses that had helped him, and pored over reports of possible Bolton loyalists in the countryside. Anyone suspected of aiding Ramsay Bolton was seized, often tortured for information. Jon heard the cries at night, echoing through the castle's stone corridors. He confronted Stannis in the solar one evening, the waning sunlight casting an orange glow on the old stone. "You cannot keep torturing suspects," Jon said, voice tense. "This is Winterfell, not a dungeon in King's Landing. You're turning the people against you, not winning them over." Stannis looked up from a ledger where he was tallying supplies. "I will do what is necessary to maintain order. The North must learn that I am not to be trifled with." Jon felt his temper flare. "They are stubborn, yes, but they're also proud. They respect loyalty, justice, honesty, not cruelty." Stannis rose abruptly. "Are you calling me cruel? Was it cruel to free them from the Boltons?" "Freedom without respect is just another form of tyranny," Jon retorted. The king's eyes narrowed. "Mind your words. I am king. You are but a watcher on the wall. You have no claim here." Jon stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "I have more of a claim than you do by blood if not by law. And I care more for these people than you ever could." That final statement hung in the air. Stannis's anger was nearly palpable. For a moment, Jon thought the king would strike him. But Melis, Andre, who had been standing near the window like a silent flame, spoke. "My king, perhaps we should turn our attention to the future. The war is not won if the Boltons remain at large, and if the others are truly on the march." Stannis exhaled sharply, glancing between Jon and the Red Woman. "Yes," he said at length. "The others. I must secure my rule in the north before turning my attention to this threat. But I will not have my authority questioned at every turn. Winterfell is mine. Let the Lord see what becomes of those who defy the will of their rightful king." Jon felt a surge of helplessness. The more Stannis clung to power through fear, the more the northern houses would resist him. The more they resisted, the harsher he would become, until the realm they both needed united was irrevocably broken. As he turned to leave, Melisandre's soft voice followed him. "Do not despair, Jon Snow. The flames have shown me that your role in this tale is far from over. The blade called Lightbringer may yet find its true bearer." Jon wanted to retort that he didn't care about her prophecies, that he cared only for the living who suffered under another would-be conqueror. But he said nothing, walking away with a heart heavy as stone. That night, he wandered the godswood of Winterfell, remembering the tales old Nan had spun for him when he was but a boy in the castle's halls. How the old kings of winter once knelt beneath the weirwood's red leaves. How they guarded the north from any and all who would harm it. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the heart tree. His pale bark glowed faintly in the moonlight. The carved face, solemn, ancient, seemed to watch him with unblinking red eyes. He knelt and bowed his head, not entirely sure what he prayed for. Perhaps he prayed for guidance, for a sign that there was a better way than the madness unraveling within Winterfell's walls. Perhaps he prayed for forgiveness, for the lines he was crossing, for the oath he was bending. The wind whispered through the branches, a faint rustling, but gave him no answers. By the time he left the Godswood, the hour was late. The rest of the castle lay still, save for the periodic footfalls of guards making their rounds. Jon slipped through the corridors, lost in his own thoughts, until a faint scream jolted him from his reverie. It came from somewhere down the hall, the direction of the old dungeons that the Boltons had refitted for their vile purposes. His blood ran cold. Another suspect? Another victim of interrogation? He rushed toward the sound, and soon encountered two of Stannis' guards outside a heavy iron door. They stiffened as he approached, though they did not move to stop him. Within, Jon could hear muffled pleas for mercy. He pushed the door open to find Stannis himself standing over a bound prisoner, a knife in hand. Blood stained the floor. Melisandre stood in the corner, her expression distant, as though she were merely an observer of a necessary ritual. Davos was there too, his face drawn and ashen, but he dared not speak against his king. "What are you doing?" Jon demanded, shock and horror shaking his voice. Stannis barely spared him a glance. This man conspired to open the gates for Ramsay Bolton. He endangered every life in Winterfell. He must confess his treachery. Jon looked at the prisoner, a trembling, middle-aged stable hand, his face bruised and bloody. He managed to sputter, "I was forced. I had no choice," before dissolving into ragged sobs. "The truth," Stannis roared. "Who else helped you?" The stable hand could only weep. Jon felt a surge of revulsion at the brutality. He had seen horrors beyond the wall, fought whites and watched friends die. But this felt different, human cruelty, inflicted in the name of power and authority. "Enough," Jon said, stepping forward. "We don't do this here." Stannis glared. "Who are you to say what we do or do not do?" "I am the king. I will root out every last traitor." Jon set his jaw. "Not like this." He reached for Stannis' wrist, intending to wrest the blade away. In that moment, the king tore his arm free, eyes wild with fury, and lashed out. The knife slashed across Jon's shoulder, a shallow cut but enough to send a hot pulse of pain down his arm. Davos shouted, "Your Grace, stop!" But it was too late. Jon's reflexes took over. He drove his fist into Stannis' chest, shoving him back, the blade clattering on the stones. The king staggered, breath ragged, and for a heartbeat, their eyes locked in mutual disbelief at what had just transpired. Jon's mind whirled. He knew he had crossed a line, laid hands upon a king. Stannis reached for his sword, face contorted with rage. Jon's own sword was belted at his side. The entire room seemed suspended in a moment of dreadful stillness. Then Stannis drew his sword in one swift motion and lunged at Jon. The ring of steel echoed off the damp walls. Jon, adrenaline surging, barely managed to draw Longclaw in time to parry. Their blades clashed, sparks dancing in the torchlight. "Jon, no!" Davos cried, scrambling to intercede. But Melisandre's arm shot out, barring him. She watched with an intensity that bordered on fascination. Stannis pressed forward with brute force, his teeth bared. "You betray me now, Snow? After all I've done for the North? You betray your own cause," Jon rasped, dodging a swipe aimed at his neck. "By turning on the people you want to rule." Sparks flew again as their swords collided. Stannis was older, but he was strong, fueled by fury and a grim determination. Jon was younger, faster, and honed by his time fighting wildlings and White Walkers. They circled one another, the prisoner on the ground forgotten, Davos frozen with horror, Melisandre gazing as though witnessing destiny itself. Each clash of steel reverberated through Jon's bones. He felt a flood of conflicting emotions. Sorrow for the man he had tried to help, anger at Stannis' cruelty, fear at what this meant for the North. But he could not allow this madness to continue. Stannis attacked again, a powerful overhead blow that Jon sidestepped at the last moment. He brought Longclaw around in a swift arc, aiming for the king's exposed flank. But Stannis' armor turned the blade aside with a grating screech. The king pivoted and struck again. This time, Jon met him head-on, the two blades sliding against each other until they locked at the hilt, their faces inches apart. "You are nothing," Stannis hissed. "A bastard pretender." Jon wrenched his sword free and slammed the pommel into Stannis' helmet. The king stumbled, disoriented. With a surge of momentum, Jon knocked the blade from Stannis' grasp. It skittered across the stones out of reach. Panting, Stannis dropped to a knee, fighting to regain his balance. Jon loomed over him, Longclaw raised. A single stroke could end it. But in that moment, Jon hesitated. He thought of the vow he had sworn, the promise to protect the realm, the times he had tried to save Stannis from his own folly. Killing a king was treason, it would mark him forever. Yet to let Stannis live might doom the North to endless tyranny, might fracture any hope of unity in the face of the coming darkness. Stannis lifted his head, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. "Do it," he spat. "Kill your king. Prove you are as treacherous as the rest of your family." Jon's teeth clenched. Melisandre's voice drifted from behind them. "The fires have shown this moment, Jon Snow." Time seemed to slow. Jon thought of Ned Stark, of the measure of honor by which he had lived. He thought of the thousands of Northerners who would pay the price for Stannis' reign of terror. He thought of the White Walkers, unstoppable unless the realm could unite. His heart pounded, sweat mingling with blood. Then Longclaw descended, swift and merciful, across Stannis' neck. The king's eyes widened in shock. A spurt of red splashed the cold stones, and his body slumped to the side, lifeless. Silence filled the dungeon corridor, broken only by the ragged breathing of those who witnessed the act. Melisandre's eyes widened, a strange mixture of triumph and horror in her expression. Davos stood frozen in place, disbelief etched into every line of his face. The prisoner cringed in the corner, too terrified to speak. Jon found himself staring at the sword in his hand, the Valyrian steel stained with the king's blood. His breath came in trembling gasps. He had done it. He had killed Stannis Baratheon, the man who would be king, who believed himself Azor Ahai. In that single stroke, Jon had broken his vows and changed the fate of the North. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, no one moved. Then Melisandre stepped forward, eyes like glowing embers. She sank to her knees beside Stannis' body, touching the pommel of the fallen sword, Lightbringer, as she had called it. A faint hiss escaped her lips, as though she felt a great power extinguished. She raised her gaze to Jon. You were the one in the flames," she whispered. "All along." Davos found his voice at last. "What have you done?" He breathed, tears forming in his eyes. "He was my king." Jon swallowed hard, his mouth dry as ash. "He was killing the North," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "He would have destroyed everything we stand for." Davos looked as though he might lash out, but his better sense held him back. Perhaps part of him knew the truth, that Stannis had lost himself long ago, and that his tyranny could not stand. Then Melisandre rose, her red cloak flowing behind her. She approached Jon, her gaze unwavering. "Lawler has chosen you, Azor Ahai reborn. You have ended the false path and claimed the destiny that is yours." Jon recoiled from her touch. "I don't want your destiny. I don't want your god." Her eyes flickered with that mysterious fire. "The sword. Take up Lightbringer." He stared at the fallen weapon in the pool of Stannis' blood. Faint wisps of steam rose from the metal, as though it still held some residual heat. Slowly, as though compelled by a force he could not name, Jon stooped and picked up the sword, felt oddly warm in his hand. A jolt of strange energy coursed through him, quickening his pulse. Melisandre's voice was low, reverent. "The prince that was promised. The warrior of light." "Stop," Jon pleaded, dropping his gaze. He could barely think, his mind awash in the enormity of what he had done. He felt horror at the idea of being hailed as some kind of chosen one. Yet as he lifted his eyes, he saw the faint glow of the sword's steel, reflecting torchlight in a way that Longclaw never had. Davos knelt beside Stannis's body, his hand trembling over the dead man's shoulder. "I followed you to the ends of the earth," he murmured. "Forgive me, my friend." The prisoner, forgotten until that moment, managed to scramble away, weeping with relief that he yet lived. Jon took a step back, breathing hard. He looked at Longclaw in one hand, Lightbringer in the other. He had never imagined he would come to such a moment, standing over the body of a king he himself had slain. At last he turned to Davos. "Ser Davos, I'm sorry. He gave me no choice." Davos rose slowly, wiping a tear from his cheek. He was a good man once, but the things he did... He let his voice trail off, eyes flicking to Melisandre. "And you, my lady, what role did you play in all of this? Did you not promise him victory?" Melisandre's face was pale, the flickering torch casting shadows across her cheeks. "Prophecies are not always clear. They can deceive even the wisest among us." Davos gave a harsh laugh, devoid of mirth. "Deceive, yes, and now he's dead." Jon could bear the dungeon no longer. He turned and strode toward the door, Lightbringer still clutched in his blood-stained fist. Melisandre and Davos followed in stunned silence, leaving Stannis's body behind. The guard stepped aside, ashen-faced, not daring to meet Jon's eyes. Word spread through Winterfell like wildfire. Stannis was dead by Jon Snow's hand. Shock turned to confusion, which turned to fear. Men loyal to Stannis raged, calling Jon a traitor and regicide. Northerners whispered that the bastard of Ned Stark had finally taken matters into his own hands. The lords of Cerwyn and Hornwood demanded an audience, uncertain whom to pledge fealty to now. The Mormonts seemed grimly satisfied, though cautious, as if they had expected some turn of events all along. Within an hour, Jon was summoned to the Great Hall by a group of knights and northern lords who demanded an explanation. He stood before them with Tormund, Davos, and a handful of men from the Watch who had come south with him. Melisandre hovered at the edges, silent as a looming presence. Jorel Mormont fixed Jon with a steely gaze. "Is it true? Did you kill Stannis Baratheon?" Jon nodded. "He attacked me, left me no choice." A ripple of murmuring spread through the hall. One of the Baratheon knights, Sir Clayton Willis, stepped forward. "You murdered the rightful king of Westeros. You will be executed for treason." Jon lifted his chin, though he felt the weight of all eyes upon him. Stannis had become a tyrant. He was torturing innocents, threatening to burn the North into submission. "Is that the king you truly served?" Sir Clayton's face reddened, but he was restrained by a sharp word from Davos. "Stannis was my friend and my king," Davos said, "but he lost his way. Jon Snow speaks the truth." Jon's heart lurched at Davos's defense. He knew how much Stannis had meant to the Onion Knight, and the pain it caused him to speak those words. Some of the northern lords exchanged looks. One spat on the ground. "If Stannis is gone, what becomes of Winterfell? Will the Boltons return?" Before Jon could answer, Melisandre's voice rose, echoing in the cavernous hall. "Winterfell belongs to the one true heir of House Stark. Jon Snow is the son of Ned Stark's blood, the man who has proven he will defend the North from all threats, be they Boltons or White Walkers." Her words stirred a fresh wave of murmurs. Jon felt a surge of apprehension. He did not want this role. Yet as he looked around at the battered men, the fearful servants, the vacant eyes of those who had endured too much war, he realized the North desperately needed leadership. "Winterfell belongs to the Starks," Jorel Mormont repeated. "Yet we have no knowledge of any living Trueborn Stark save for the rumors of Sansa or Rickon. Where are they now? No one knows." Jon's voice caught. He had no idea where Sansa or Arya or Rickon might be. For all he knew, they were dead. "My father never wanted me to claim the Stark name," he said softly. "I am a brother of the Night's Watch." A roar of anger came from some corners. "The Night's Watch vow does not allow you to be king in the north," others shouted. But Tormund stepped forward, his voice booming. "What good are vows if the world is overrun by an army of dead men? Jon Snow saved the free folk. He's the only man who cared more about the living than about old feuds. I follow him. Wouldn't you?" Those words hung in the air like a challenge. Jarell glanced at her fellow Northerners. "We remember Ned Stark," she said softly. "We remember how he fought for what was right, no matter the cost." She looked at Jon. "If you would lead us, bastard or not, we will stand behind you. The North needs a Stark." Jon felt his heart hammering in his chest, a tumult of fear, longing, and a fierce protectiveness. He thought of the white shadows beyond the wall, of the countless innocents across the North who needed hope. Stannis had tried to force them into submission and had died by his hand. Could Jon do better? He took a deep breath. "I never asked to lead," he said, his voice firm yet tinged with sadness. "But the North is on the brink of destruction. The Boltons may return, or worse, the White Walkers will march south. If you will have me as a Stark, I will do my utmost to protect these lands, just as my father would have. But I do not wish to break my vows lightly." Sir Clayton sneered. "You broke them the moment you killed your king." Davos intervened again, his voice measured. "He killed a man who had become a threat to the very people he claimed to protect. Perhaps it was an act of true loyalty to the realm." The Northern lords conferred in low tones. At last, Jarell Mormont stepped forward, speaking on behalf of them all. "Jon Snow, if you will claim Winterfell in the name of House Stark, then the North will rally behind you. We will forgive the circumstances of your birth. We will look to you for guidance in these dark times. You are Ned Stark's son. You have proven your valor." A wave of agreement, some reluctant, some more enthusiastic, rippled through the hall. Jon stood motionless, feeling the weight of their expectation pressing down on him. He recalled the words of his vow, "Night gathers and now my watch begins." He had never imagined he would face such a choice, to lay aside that vow for a greater duty to a family name he had never been allowed to wear. He saw Melisandre's fervent stare, as though she already knew what he would say. Tormund gave him an encouraging nod. Davos looked pained, but not unsupportive. Sir Clayton scowled. Perhaps there would be no placating some men. At last, Jon spoke. "Very well. I will do what I must to protect the North, in the name of the house that fostered and raised me. If that requires me to claim the seat of Winterfell, I will. But know this, my first aim is to unite the realm against the true threat, those who come with the cold from beyond the wall. There will be no more cruelty, no more forced subjugation, no more burning men in the name of any god. The North deserves better." A murmur of assent rolled through the crowd. Sensing the moment, Melisandre stepped forward, holding up Lightbringer in both hands. The sword gleamed in the flickering torchlight, its steel catching every reflection of the flames. "Behold Lightbringer," she intoned, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "The sword of Azor Ahai reborn, now wielded by Jon Snow. In his hand, this blade shall defend the living and banish the darkness." Jon felt a swirl of conflicting feelings as she offered the sword to him. He already held Longclaw, the blade his father had given him. And yet, he knew this moment was symbolic. The Northerners might not care about the foreign prophecy, but Melisandre's dramatic display carried weight in its own way. He took the sword from her, feeling that same eerie warmth pulsing through the steel. The hall fell silent as he held it aloft. A subtle hush, as if the old stones of Winterfell recognized some shifting tide of fate. Then Jarell Mormont sank to one knee, her companions following suit. Tormund folded his arms, smirking, but he gave Jon a slight bow of the head. Davos, after a moment's hesitation, bowed as well, tears still glistening in his eyes. The entire hall knelt, save for a few Baratheon loyalists who stood in shock or dismay at the sight of their king's killer being hailed as a new ruler. But they were outnumbered, and the tide had turned. In that moment, Jon Snow became the one who held Winterfell, the shield of the North, and if Melisandre was to be believed, the chosen champion of her god. He felt no surge of elation, only a quiet dread at the enormity of what lay before him. The war with the Boltons was not finished. The realm was fractured, and winter's icy grasp tightened by the day. Worse still, the dead walked beyond the wall, an unstoppable force marching ever closer. Quietly, he lowered the sword and spoke to the assembled lords. "Rise, please. I am no king, but I will. Protect the North as if I were. Then call yourself king in the North." One of the men cried, emboldened by the moment. "We have not had a king in the North since Robb Stark." A roar of agreement rose, echoing off the rafters. Jon's heart pounded. The memory of Robb's bloody fate at the Twins haunted him. Yet the crowd would not be denied. They were hungry for unity, for a leader they could believe in after so much betrayal. Tormund leaned in, muttering, "Embrace it, boy. They want you. The question is, can you handle it?" Jon scanned the faces, hopeful, wary, anguished. He thought of Ned and Robb, of the crypts below Winterfell where the bones of the Stark kings lay in silent vigil. To lead the North in the war to come might be the only way to save them all. At length he nodded. "Then I will be king in the North, as long as you will follow me. And I swear that I will do all in my power to defend these lands from any threat, human or otherwise." The hall erupted in a thunderous chant. "The king in the North! The king in the North!" Jon stood amidst the clamor, snow swirling outside the ancient walls, Lightbringer in his hand. He had killed one king and, in doing so, found himself crowned another. He did not know if he would be worthy of the name, or if the North would survive the darkness on the horizon. But for now, at least, he had given them hope, and in a world so ravaged by war and winter, hope might be the most precious gift of all. Yet as Melisandre's chanting voice joined the clamor, and the Northmen raised their swords in salute, Jon caught a glimpse of something deeper in her eyes, a secret knowledge that this was only the beginning of a storm that would test every oath he had ever made, and challenge the very blood in his veins. And so began the reign of Jon Snow, the man who slew a king to save the North, and the one to whom the fires had pointed as Azor Ahai reborn. It was a reign born of violence and necessity, cloaked in prophecy and shadow, and the snows of winter would not relent. Beyond the wall, the dead stirred. Beyond the narrow seas, other forces moved. And within Winterfell, a new king bore both the name of Stark and the blade called Lightbringer, determined to stand against the darkness, even if it meant shouldering the burden of a destiny he had never wanted. Jon Snow stood in the great hall of Winterfell as voices chanting "The King in the North" gradually subsided. He could feel his pulse thrumming in his ears, the weight of 1,000 expectations settling upon him like a fresh snowfall. The long, cold stones beneath his feet were marked with the footprints of lords and knights who had only moments ago sworn to follow him. Yet echoes of the violence that brought him here still lingered in the corridors. The memory of Stannis Baratheon's last, gasping breath stuck in Jon's mind as if it were painted on the backs of his eyelids. He had never wanted to be a king. He had not even wanted to be legitimized. But necessity, like a sharpened sword, had cut his choices to the bone. A hush spread through the hall. Some men and women watched him with curiosity, waiting for his first act as the newly acclaimed king in the North. Others stared with plain suspicion or resentment. A few Baratheon loyalists still looked at him in horror or silent hatred, as if they could not decide whether to throw themselves upon him in anger or slink away into the shadows. Melisandre lingered near the back, her red robes catching the torchlight, her ruby pendant pulsing with subdued fire. He could sense her gaze, even when he did not look directly at her. Jon, still clutching Lightbringer in one hand and Longclaw sheathed at his hip, felt an unsettling warmth emanating from the fabled sword. It did not burn like actual flame, yet the steel carried an odd heat, as if awakened by the blood it had spilled. It reminded him too much of the act he had just committed. If a name or a title was the price for ensuring the North's survival, was that truly a victory, or was it the beginning of something far darker? He squared his shoulders and faced those gathered. The nearest were Tormund Giantsbane, Jorel Mormont, Ser Davos, and a handful of Serwyn and Hornwood men. Beyond them, the hall was crowded with soldiers, servants, and others of uncertain allegiance. "Please," Jon said, lifting his voice so it carried. "We've had enough bloodshed for one night. There will be no executions without just cause. I know many of you are loyal to Stannis. He was your king. But understand, he gave me no choice." His throat felt tight as he forced the words out. He wanted to rule the North by fear. That is not what the North needs. A Baratheon knight, Sir Clayton Willis, stepped forward. His fists were clenched at his sides, face still red with anger. "You speak of fear, yet you slew a king. Why should we trust you not to do the same to us the moment we displease you?" Jon set Lightbringer's tip to the ground, as if planting a banner. "Because I serve no foreign god nor foreign ambition. I did not slay Stannis in pursuit of a crown. I did it to protect those he was determined to harm. And if you doubt that, then watch me carefully. If you see me becoming as he was, I beg you to stop me." A tense silence followed. Jon suspected that for some of these men, no amount of explanation would ever absolve him. Yet a few in the crowd seemed to relax, as if accepting he might not become the next ruthless tyrant. Jorel Mormont glanced around, meeting the eyes of those from her retinue, then bowed her head in Jon's direction, a small gesture of confidence. Tormund's booming voice cut through the uneasy hush. "Are we done standing around like a bunch of old goats? It's cold as a White Walker's arse in here, and we've got wounded folk who need tending." That fight out in the yard wasn't exactly a dance. A few men gave hollow chuckles. Jon nodded, grateful for Tormund's intervention. "Yes, let's see to the wounded first. Then I'll meet with the lords, both northern and former Baratheon allies, to discuss how we move forward. We need unity, not more death." With that, the newly proclaimed king in the north turned and descended the dais. Some parted before him in a respectful hush. Others stared daggers into his back. Ser Davos stood by the doorway, his face a tapestry of grief and loyalty torn asunder. When Jon approached, Davos bowed his head. He did not kneel. Jon could see the conflict in the older man's eyes, the heartbreak of losing Stannis, but also the relief of escaping the king's downward spiral into cruelty. Jon paused. "Davos, I am truly sorry." The older knight pressed his lips together. "I know you are. Stannis was my friend, my king, but he was lost. A part of me wants to blame you, but in my heart, I know he forced your hand." Jon reached out, setting a hand on Davos's shoulder. "I meant what I said. If you see me turning as he did, do not hesitate to stop me." Davos gave a grim nod. "He was a good man once. War changes us, prophecy changes us. Don't let it change you, my lord, my king." Jon inclined his head, then continued out into the courtyard. Night had fully claimed the sky, and the wind blew sharp gusts of snow along the ramparts. Torches flickered, revealing the ravages of the recent battle. Fallen men lay haphazardly across the yard. A few hapless survivors moaned in pain, while others hurried to carry them toward makeshift infirmaries in the castle's chambers. Over by the stables, a group of free folk silently helped gather the bodies, friend and foe alike. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the scale of death. This was only one battle, a taste of what might come when the true enemy arrived. He could almost envision an army of the dead pouring over the horizon. If the North couldn't stand united against that, all these sacrifices would be for nothing. He set aside Lightbringer for a moment, giving it to one of the men who had accompanied him from Castle Black. The man held the sword as if it might burn him. Jon spared him a small, apologetic nod, then knelt next to a wounded soldier. The man's cloak was soaked red, his breathing shallow, a sworn sword of hornwood, by the look of his crest. Jon pressed a hand to the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, and called for a maester. In the flurry of triage, the pressing matters of rulership fell away. Jon worked alongside the others in simple tasks, tearing strips of cloth, holding a wounded man's hand, whispering small comforts. It was not until dawn began to lighten the sky that the last of the injured had been seen to, and the dead laid out in ordered rows by the entrance to the old crypts. Dawn brought a brittle cold that seeped into every corner of Winterfell. Jon found himself crossing the yard toward the ancient gate that led to the Godswood, seeking a moment of quiet reflection before he had to face the hundreds of questions and demands that would inevitably descend upon him. As he passed under the archway, he noticed that Melisandre trailed him, silent as a shadow. She followed him into the Godswood without asking leave, stepping carefully through the fresh snow. The white expanse seemed almost untouched. Snow dusted the crimson leaves of the weirwood, making them appear as though they dripped blood onto a clean white canvas. When Jon stopped near the heart tree, Melisandre halted at a respectful distance. He stared at the carved face, remembering how he had prayed there as a boy, uncertain of his place in Ned Stark's family. Now, decades of guilt and grief seemed to converge upon him. His father's execution, his brother's lost, his sister's fates unknown, and the vow he had once taken to defend the realm as a brother of the Night's Watch. It felt as if he stood at the edge of a precipice, with the entire north on his shoulders and nothing but the endless dark on the other side. He exhaled, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Why me? Why does your God point to me and not someone else?" Melisandre's soft footsteps approached. She did not stand too close, but enough that he could feel her presence. "The Lord of Light reveals only fragments. I believed Stannis was the chosen one, for his qualities seemed to match the portents. Born amidst salt and smoke, awakened dragons from stone, the sword named Lightbringer. Yet the vision was hazy. I misread the signs." She inclined her head toward him. "You, Jon Snow, are the one the flames truly favor." He gave a derisive snort. "You favored Stannis until the moment he died. Now you cling to me. I'm no champion. I'm just—" He hesitated, words failing him. "Just a man who did what he thought was right." "Many prophecies hinge on the smallest of mortal choices," Melisandre said gently. "Yet if you hold Lightbringer, and if you wear the name of Stark, the blood of the first men and the blood of the dragon, then you may be the only hope the living have against the darkness. The others will not be stopped by steel alone. They are an ancient evil, and fire is their bane." Jon turned away, refusing to let her see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Whether I am chosen or not, there is work to be done. If you truly believe in saving the realm, you will help me unify the North. But if you plan on burning people as sacrifices or forcing your religion on them, I won't tolerate it." Melisandre's expression was difficult to read, shadowed by the weirwood's crimson branches. "I will not burn innocents, if that is your will. But know that the power of Lawler may be needed to fight the White Walkers. Will you forbid me from using the gifts the Lord of Light has granted me?" He hesitated. He had witnessed her birth a shadow that killed Renly Baratheon, seen her claim miraculous powers of resurrection, though he had never seen it done. He had heard rumors, stories from the free folk who once huddled around her fires. Could such sorcery help them survive the winter to come? "You can serve your God," he said at last, "as long as you don't harm those who stand with me. No more burnings, no more sacrifices." She bowed her head. "As you wish, but I believe that all light must be fueled by something. I will seek my answers in the flames, and if a time comes when only fire can push back the cold, you must be prepared to accept that. For now, I will abide by your will." Jon felt uneasy about the half-hidden meaning in her words, but let it go. The Northerners would never accept another wave of burnings in the name of a Southern god. He turned back to the heart tree, placing a palm against its cold bark. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he whispered, "to the old gods or to no one at all." Then he stepped away, leaving the Godswood behind with Melisandre following in silence. By mid-morning, Winterfell's great hall was once again packed. The lords of Cerwyn, Hornwood, Mormont, and various smaller houses that had fought against the Boltons or come south with Stannis crowded the benches. Free folk representatives, including Tormund and a few of the clan chieftains, stood in the back, uneasy within the walls of a castle but grimly determined to hear Jon's words. A handful of Baratheon knights and soldiers lingered warily, uncertain whether they should remain in the north or return south. Tension simmered, and only the presence of guards wearing Stark livery and a new sense of authority invested in Jon kept the unrest from boiling over. Jon took the Lord's seat at the head of the hall, feeling its ancient heft. The seat was not a formal throne. It was a modest, high-backed chair carved from dark wood, older than memory. Yet in that moment, it felt like a throne of ice and stone bearing down on him. He searched the crowd, finding Ser Davos near the front, offering a slow nod of encouragement. Jorel Mormont watched with steeled composure. A few lesser lords, eyes still ringed with sleeplessness, whispered to one another behind their hands. Jon cleared his throat and began. "We cannot forget that House Bolton is still out there. Ramsay Bolton escaped the field, and by all accounts, he is ruthless. If he musters what remains of his forces, or calls upon any supporters, he could strike at Winterfell. We have to be prepared." He let his gaze sweep across the listeners. "But the Boltons are not the greatest threat we face. The true enemy comes from beyond the wall." A hush fell. Even the Baratheon men seemed curious. One stepped forward, an older knight with silver hair. "The undead? I'd always heard those were only bedtime stories." Some of the free folk snorted. Tormund barked, "Bedtime stories that killed half our people, Silverhair. They're real and they're coming." He glared around the hall. "You lot south of the wall hide behind your stones, thinking you're safe. You're not. When the White Walkers march, your kingdoms and your fancy houses won't mean a damn thing." A stir of nervous shifting swept through the crowd. Jon leaned forward. "Tormund is right. I fought them. If we keep fighting among ourselves, we'll be easy prey. We need to unite. Every house of the north, the free folk, even any southern allies willing to help." "But how do we unite the north?" asked Lord Hornwood, a thin, balding man with a reedy voice. "Some houses are sworn to the Boltons or to the Umbers, or have scattered loyalties since the War of the Five Kings. The Karstarks are scattered. The Glovers won't trust easily. We do it by showing them we mean to protect them, not to threaten them," Jon said. "We'll send envoys with news of Stannis' death and the removal of Bolton rule over Winterfell. We'll make it clear that we welcome all who pledge to defend the North from what's coming. No more forced tribute, no more hostage takings, no more torture." He glanced at Davos, who lowered his gaze in acknowledgement. "I want our envoys to be accompanied by some of the free folk. Let each house see that we stand together. Then they can decide if they want to stand with us as well." An uneasy murmur passed through the audience. Some still felt wary about free folk raiders and old grudges from centuries of conflict. But Tormund, for his part, spat onto the floor. "Fine by me. We won't kneel to you or your laws, but we'll stand by those who treat us fair. If any house is too blind to see the threat, that's their funeral." "It's a start," said Jorel Mormont, folding her arms. "House Mormont is small in number, but we are with you, Jon Snow. Or should I call you Jon Stark?" Jon's chest tightened at the mention of the name. The memory of how Stannis had once offered to legitimize him rose unbidden, along with the thought of Robb's doomed campaign. "Jon Snow," he corrected quietly. "If the realm insists on calling me Stark, I won't deny it, but You're Ned Stark's blood," Jorel insisted. "The North needs to see that name restored. If it helps bring the houses together, let them call you Stark. You're a king now, after all." Jon swallowed, but he nodded once. "Very well. For the sake of unity, if that name helps people trust my intentions, I'll bear it. But let my deeds speak louder than my birth or my name." Sir Clayton Willis, standing among a small knot of Baratheon loyalists, scowled. "And what of us who followed Stannis? Are we to be sent away or made prisoner?" Jon regarded him steadily. "Those who wish to serve in the North's defense are welcome to stay, provided they swear not to commit violence against our people or stir up rebellion. Those who wish to depart south may do so. I will not hold you hostage for Stannis' actions." A wave of relief mixed with lingering wariness passed over the Baratheon knights. Some looked as though they might be eager to leave this frozen land behind, while others had nowhere else to go. "Then I will remain," said Sir Clayton, albeit stiffly. "If I am to fight, I'd rather it be against these undead you speak of than return to a realm that's as broken as this one. But know that I will watch your every move, Snow." Jon gave a curt nod, suppressing the flicker of irritation at the man's stubborn hostility. "Watch all you like. We need good swords, and as long as you don't repeat Stannis' mistakes, you'll have a place here." A few voices rose in agreement. Others asked about logistics, food stores, winter provisions, the plan for fortifying Winterfell in case the Boltons returned. The conversation quickly devolved into the practicalities of leadership. Rationing, stockpiles, the necessity of patrolling the roads to keep them open for trade. Jon took note of every concern, designating tasks to men he trusted, or at least men who seemed competent. Davos, though still grieving, agreed to oversee the distribution of supplies, leaning on the knack for logistics he'd honed as the Onion Knight. Tormund took on the role of a liaison between free folk and northern houses, albeit reluctantly. Jarell Mormont promised she would send ravens to Bear Island, instructing her younger kinswomen to prepare any resources they could spare. By the time the meeting ended, it was nearly midday. A pale winter sun filtered through the stained glass high above, casting shifting patterns on the stone floor. The crowd dispersed, men drifting away to carry out their orders. Jon lingered near the dais, physically and mentally exhausted. He could see the path ahead already spiking with difficulties. Even if he convinced every house to rally under his banner, the White Walkers' threat might prove unstoppable. Even if they somehow managed to stand together, there was the matter of the Iron Throne and the ongoing chaos in the southern kingdoms. Everything was uncertain. A soft cough drew his attention. Melisandre stood at the edge of the hall, her ruby catching the sunlight and shimmering with unnerving brilliance. Jon strode toward her, intending to pass by without speaking, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "There is something you must see," she said. "Something I saw in my fires last night. A glimpse of the future, or a possible future." Jon felt a pulse of dread. If it's another prophecy, save it. I'm tired of chasing shadows and cryptic visions. She inclined her head. I understand your wariness, but this vision was clearer than any I've had before. I saw a man with your face, standing upon the battlements of a broken wall of ice, wielding a blade of fire against a tide of walking corpses. I saw a direwolf's banner snapping in the wind, half buried in snow, and I saw a queen with hair of silver, riding upon wings of flame. Jon's brow furrowed. He had heard rumors of a Targaryen queen across the sea, Daenerys Stormborn, though he barely knew if the rumors were true. The rest of the vision, though, standing upon a broken wall of ice, the notion filled him with cold terror. Did that mean the wall itself would fall? "I don't know what to do with this," he said. "Visions can mean many things." She nodded. "Indeed, but they often show us what awaits if we do not act. If the wall falls, it will be because the others break it. Fire must meet ice. You hold a key to that fire in your hand now." Jon closed his eyes, letting out a weary breath. "Then the only answer is to gather everyone we can and strengthen the wall, or at least prepare for the day the dead reach it. I have no idea how to contact this silver-haired queen across the sea, if she even exists." Melisandre's expression flickered with something akin to excitement. "If she is truly a Targaryen, she could be your ally. The fires suggest she has dragons." "Dragons?" Jon repeated, half in disbelief. "That's a story for children. They once lived, as real as dire wolves in the snow. It is said that if Daenerys Targaryen indeed hatched 3 dragons, she would be the first dragon rider in a century." Jon rubbed at his forehead. "The White Walkers are threat enough. If she crosses the sea with an army and dragons, the entire realm could burn. Or she could save it," Melisandre countered softly. fire against ice. Perhaps you are meant to join forces. The prophecy speaks of a song of ice and fire. You are of the north, and if her blood is that of the dragons, then she is fire incarnate. He could feel a headache forming. The last thing he wanted was more prophecy. I can't leave Winterfell. Not now. If she comes, we'll see what she wants. Until then, I have the realm to defend. Melisandre bowed her head. As you say, my king. He noted the way she called him my king, without the slightest trace of doubt, as if that had been fated all along. Turning away, he strode through the hall, seeking fresh air in the courtyard to clear his thoughts. The day wore on, and word spread throughout Winterfell that official letters would be sent to every major and minor house in the north. Some men balked at the idea of parleying with houses that might still cling to old grudges or harbor Bolton sympathies, but Jon insisted. He took up residence in Ned Stark's old solar, a small room with a hearth, wooden shutters, and an ancient desk battered by years of use. There, under a dim candle, he drafted letters by hand, addressing them to the lords and ladies whose help they desperately needed. He wrote to the Glovers, appealing to their sense of northern unity. He wrote to the Reeds of Greywater Watch, though he knew they were elusive allies at best. He wrote to the Umbers, the Karstarks, even to lesser houses like the Tallhearts and the Dustons. In each missive, he stated that Winterfell was under the protection of Jon Stark, if that name would help, and that Stannis Baratheon was dead. No more would the North be forced to bend the knee to a southern invader. Instead, they were invited, he stressed the word invited, to unite against the threats beyond the wall and the potential resurgence of the Boltons. Between each letter, Jon paused, letting the candlelight flicker. He could almost sense his father's presence, as though Ned Stark's spirit lingered in the very stones of the castle. Would his father approve of him taking the name Stark, of him wearing a crown in the north? He had no answer. He only knew that events had spiraled beyond his control, and this was the path fate, or chance, had laid before him. When the letters were done, he sealed them with plain wax, lacking an official Stark sigil seal. Davos, who came to check on him, offered an old signet ring that bore the direwolf's head. Jon accepted it with a silent nod, pressing it into the wax of each envelope. "How do you want them delivered?" Davos asked. Jon leaned back in the creaking chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "We'll send ravens to all we can, but for houses that are close, or that might not trust a raven's message, we send riders. Northerners with the free folk to show we mean peace." Davos scratched at his beard. That might provoke some hostility. The sight of wildlings on their doorstep might not inspire confidence. "Then let them see for themselves," Jon replied. "If they attack, we'll respond with self-defense, but no vengeance. I want them to know we are not the same as the Boltons or even Stannis. If we can't earn their trust, we must at least earn their respect." Davos nodded wearily. "As you say, I'll see to it." Jon studied the older man's face. "You look exhausted. Have you slept?" A sad smile flickered over Davos's lips. "I've slept enough for one night. My dreams are troubled. But your cause is the only one that makes any sense now. Stannis was obsessed with prophecy, but perhaps you're the man he was trying to be. Perhaps you're the one who can unify this broken realm." Jon shook his head. "I'm only trying to prevent it from tearing itself apart further." "That's more than most kings attempt," Davos said softly, then left the solar to carry out his tasks. In the following days, Winterfell buzzed with anxious activity. Riders set out bearing messages, while black-caped ravens took wing from the rookery, carrying letters across the snowy expanses. Jon visited the wounded daily, ensuring they had enough supplies and warmth. He insisted that Northerners and Baratheon loyalists mingle in their duties, hoping to ease tensions. Melisandre, meanwhile, spent hours in a private chamber she had claimed, communing with her flames and speaking only rarely to Jon about what she saw. Tormund took a group of free folk to patrol the outskirts of Winterfell, clearing away leftover Bolton stragglers who had chosen to hide rather than flee. Several nights later, a flurry of riders returned, bringing news from various houses. House Serwyn remained uneasy but loyal, content to follow so long as Winterfell offered protection. House Hornwood pledged more men, provided Jon keep their lands safe from roving bandits. The Mormonts were steadfast, though their forces were too few to make much difference in a major campaign. The Glovers sent a cautious response, stating they would consider rejoining Winterfell's cause once they confirmed the truth of Stannis' death and saw a tangible benefit in aligning with Jon. The Umbers were silent, either in chaos or under Bolton intimidation. Carhold was also silent. When the messenger from the Reeds arrived, he was a small man cloaked in swampy furs, bringing a short letter from Howland Reed himself. The letter stated that Greywater Watch recognized Jon Stark as the rightful defender of the North, as Ned Stark's son. However, it offered little in the way of direct assistance, only a promise that when the time was right, House Reed would come forth to stand against the White Walkers. Jon took heart that at least they did not oppose him. Amid these diplomatic developments, Winterfell endured an onslaught of winter storms. Snow piled against the walls, and the bitter cold made every chore more difficult. Hunting parties returned with minimal game, the once rich forests now bleak and silent. The roads iced over, rendering travel dangerous. The threat of starvation loomed. Jon ordered a strict rationing of bread and grain, ensuring that the knights and the common folk alike received equal shares. Some lords grumbled, complaining they deserved more. Jon refused to bend, earning a measure of grudging respect from the small folk. The mood in the castle was tense but purposeful. Men drilled daily in the courtyard, though the biting wind often drove them indoors. At times, Jon joined them to practice with sword and shield, pushing himself to remain sharp. He bore the weight of leadership as best he could, relying on Davos for counsel, Tormund for honest opinions, and Jorel Mormont for a northern perspective. Melisandre was the wild card. Her presence unnerved many, but none could deny her conviction. Sometimes, as Jon walked the corridors, he would spot her in some shadowed corner, eyes closed, ruby gleaming, whispering strange prayers under her breath. Then, near the end of the second week after Stannis' death, a grim rider arrived in the dead of night. His horse was half dead from exhaustion, and the man himself bore frostbitten fingers. The guards rushed him to the great hall, where Jon, roused from a fitful sleep, met him by the fire. The man wore a torn cloak bearing the sigil of House Glover, stained with snow and blood. He slumped to his knees, panting. "They're coming," he managed between gasps. Jon knelt beside him, pressing a cup of warm wine into his trembling hands. "Who's coming?" "Ramsay Bolton," he rasped. "He's taken Deepwood Motte by surprise. Glover men. Most are dead, the rest fled to the woods. Ramsay's heading east, burning villages as he goes. Says he's going to take back Winterfell or leave it a ruin." A wave of dread washed over Jon. He helped the man drink, then signaled for the maester to tend to him. "Did you see how large his force was?" The messenger shook his head. "Couldn't count, but more than we had at Deepwood. Maybe 2,000, maybe 3. He's got Sellswords now, too. And worse, there's talk he's got something else. Some beast or monster. Men are terrified. I barely escaped with my life." Jon frowned, glancing at Davos and Tormund, who had hurried over. Davos's brow knit in concern. Tormund let out a grunt. "Bastard Bolton's not one to shy away from terror. Could be he's just spreading rumors." "Even so, we have to be ready," Jon said. He addressed the messenger again, voice gentle. "Thank you. You did well to bring us this warning. Rest now. We'll handle it." The man clutched Jon's wrist, eyes wild with desperation. "Don't let him flay us all," he whispered, tears beginning to form in the corners of his eyes. Then he collapsed, succumbing to exhaustion or shock. Jon stood, motioning for the maester to take the man to the infirmary. Tormund clenched his jaw. "Another fight. Not that I mind a fight, but we're low on supplies and men who can stand on 2 feet. If Ramsay's truly got 2,000 or 3,000 men, we're in for a rough time." Davos rubbed the stump where he'd once worn 4 fingers. "It may be a bluff. Ramsay is known for cunning and cruelty, not necessarily for a large host. Still, we can't dismiss it." Jon nodded grimly. We'll send out scouts at first light to confirm the numbers. In the meantime, ready what men we have. If Ramsay wants to storm Winterfell, we'll make him pay for every inch. They wasted no time. Even in the dead of night, horns sounded to rouse the garrison. Men groaned as they stumbled from their bedrolls, but the urgency in Jon's voice woke them fully. Davos organized scouts, dispatching half a dozen parties on horseback to various routes between Deepwood Motte and Winterfell. Tormund rallied free folk to prepare the outer defenses, setting up hidden trenches and wooden stakes beyond the gates. Jorel Mormont and her small retinue sharpened axes and spears, bearing the fierce determination that had made the women of Bear Island legendary. As the castle stirred, Jon climbed the battlements, scanning the dark horizon where snow drifted in pale dunes under the moonlight. Winterfell's walls stood tall, newly patched in places from the damage inflicted during prior sieges. He prayed the repairs would hold. A part of him wanted to ride out immediately to confront Ramsay on open ground, but that was too risky. Without solid intelligence on Bolton's numbers, they could be walking into a trap. He felt a presence at his side and turned to see Melisandre, face half shrouded by the hood of her red cloak. "The bastard of Bolton comes," she said quietly, as if tasting the words. "I sense his malice in the night air." Jon frowned. "If you have powers to predict how this battle will go, now would be the time to tell me." She shook her head. "I cannot see his fate clearly. The flames show only shadows, flaying knives, and the howling of hounds." She paused. "But I do see you, standing with a blade of fire in your hand. Whether that blade remains lit depends on what you choose to do." He set his jaw. "Lightbringer. You say it's mine, but I don't feel like some champion of prophecy." "Champions rarely do," she replied, her tone distant. "Yet you will do what must be done. Against the Bolton bastard you will find no mercy. Perhaps you must become as cold and hard as the winter itself." Jon's gaze drifted back to the dark plain. He wanted to save lives, not snuff them out. But perhaps there was no escaping war. If Ramsay came to claim Winterfell, he would bring blood and terror. Jon would have to meet him with equal resolve. At dawn, a muffled horn call signaled the return of the first scout. Jon and Davos hurried to the courtyard to meet him. The scout, a wiry man with an old scar running across his chin, dismounted wearily. "Ramsay's not far," he reported. "His main host is on the King's Road, heading straight this way, maybe 4 days off. I counted at least 1,000 men, but there could be more. Lots of them were wearing mismatched armor, Sellswords, no doubt. The Bolton banners were flying, though." Jon's heart sank. They had fewer than 800 men who could fight between Northerners, Baratheon loyalists, and free folk combined. The castle walls gave them an advantage, but Ramsay's numbers might simply overwhelm them if they attempted a full siege. Without more houses joining, it would be a desperate struggle. Davos cleared his throat. "We'll need to decide if we meet them on the field or hole up inside Winterfell. Stannis tried to storm Winterfell and failed, but the Boltons might have studied that battle. If they come prepared for a siege, we could be in trouble." Jon looked at the old walls, the fresh repairs that still bore the marks of hasty carpentry and mortar. "Winterfell has withstood sieges before. If we can keep them at bay, maybe other houses will rally to help, or the Boltons will lose heart." Tormund, standing behind the scout, growled. "Ramsay Bolton doesn't lose heart easily. The man's a mad dog. The longer we let him bark at our gates, the more blood he'll spill among the villages. He'll starve us out if he can. So we strike first?" Davos ventured, eyebrows lifted. "We could," Jon allowed, "but we'd be outnumbered. Unless we find a way to even the odds, we'd be riding to our own slaughter." Jorel Mormont arrived at that moment, snow dusting her dark hair. "I've spoken with some of your free folk. They mention a cunning approach. Lure Ramsay's men into unfavorable terrain, woods or marshes, then ambush them. Break their numbers up before they reach Winterfell." Jon exchanged glances with Tormund, who nodded. We know how to raid. If we can split them into smaller groups, we might stand a chance. But it'll be risky." Davos exhaled slowly. Riskier than letting them lay siege to Winterfell with no guarantee of support from the other houses? Jon considered the possibilities. An ambush would require dividing their own forces, leaving Winterfell less defended. But if Ramsay arrived with 1,000 or more, the castle might be quickly surrounded. "We'll prepare to defend the castle as if a siege is coming," he said at last. "Meanwhile, we'll send out small raiding parties, made up of free folk and a few seasoned knights, to strike at their supply lines, harry their scouts, and draw them into the forests if possible. We have to force them to spread out." Tormund cracked a fierce grin. "That's a plan I can get behind." Jarrell nodded. "House Mormont will join the raiding parties. We're good in the forests." Davos rubbed his jaw. "And I'll stay behind, help coordinate the defenses here. Ensure we have enough arrows, boiling oil, and any other advantage we can muster." Jon appreciated their willingness to act. Though it was a desperate plan, it might at least reduce Ramsay's advantage. "Do it. We have 4 days, maybe less, so every moment counts." Once again, the castle erupted into frenetic activity. Archers practiced from the walls, and oil cauldrons were set up in strategic locations. Swords were sharpened. Spare boots gathered for the men who would soon ride out to ambush the boltons. Tormund and Jarrell selected volunteers, free folk hunters, mountain clan warriors, Bear Island archers, and a handful of knights adept at fighting in rough terrain. The total force for the ambush numbered about 200, leaving Winterfell with roughly 600 defenders. Jon oversaw the preparations with a somber sense of finality. If these raids failed, if the ambushers were caught and destroyed, the North might lose its best chance at fending off Ramsay. He reminded himself that the White Walkers were the greater threat. Yet how could they ever unite the realm if they couldn't even defend Winterfell from a single bastard's aggression? The morning of the raid's departure, the sky hung low with bruised clouds. Snow drifted in intermittent flurries, and the wind cut like knives across the courtyard. Tormund and Jarrell checked their packs one last time, ensuring they had rations and gear for travel through the forest. Dozens of horses stamped and snorted, their breath steaming. Jon handed Tormund a small bundle of spare arrows. "Use them wisely. We don't have many Fletchers here." Tormund nodded, then clapped Jon on the shoulder. "We'll bleed the Bolton bastard. Keep Winterfell warm for me." Jarrell Mormont donned a thick fur cloak. "Trust us, we've hunted men in these woods before. The old ways might give us an edge." She paused, looking Jon in the eye. "Don't let the castle fall while we're gone." Jon gave a grim smile. "I'll do my best." He stood at the gate, watching as the 200 riders, and a few on foot, disappeared into the swirling snow. Melisandre stood nearby, silent as she observed their departure. Jon wondered if her prophecies told her how this would end, but she offered no words. The gate closed, the portcullis rattling shut, and Winterfell felt emptier, the courtyard quieter. That quiet did not last long. By midday, another scout galloped into the yard, shouting that he had spotted Bolton outriders only a day's ride west. The entire castle braced for an imminent confrontation. Men were assigned to the walls, arrows distributed, pitch heated. Davos took up a command post near the battlements, while Jon paced the corridors, checking with the maesters about the state of their provisions. Night fell early, as it often did in winter, and the watchfires glowed against the inky sky. There was no sign of Ramsay's army, but an unmistakable tension hung over every stone, every gust of icy wind. Jon's thoughts strayed to Tormund and Jarrell, hoping their ambush had succeeded in drawing off some of Ramsay's men. As dawn broke, a heavy snowstorm swept in, blinding the ramparts with swirling white. The watchers could see only a short distance beyond the walls. By midday, the storm lessened, but visibility remained poor. Men kept their bows ready, but no enemy approached. Anxiety gnawed at the defenders. That evening, just as dusk began to smear the sky with purple, the gates opened to admit a group of riders returning from the raid. Their horses stumbled, caked in ice, faces streaked with dirt and blood. They guided their mounts into the courtyard. Jon hurried out to meet them, praying to see Tormund or Jarrell among them. To his relief, he spotted Tormund, helmetless, hair stiff with frost. He half slid off his horse, groaning in pain. "We got a chunk of them," he growled, teeth chattering. "Ambushed a scouting party, 50 men, maybe. Killed most, the rest ran. Then we torched one of their supply wagons. Lost about 20 of ours in the process." Jarell Mormont, her cloak torn, dismounted nearby. "We got separated from the rest. Some men chased after a bigger group of Bolton soldiers. We couldn't hold them. They had more men than we expected." Jon helped steady Tormund, guiding him inside. "We'll get you warm. Did you see Ramsay? Or any sign of his main force?" Tormund spat onto the stone floor. "We saw glimpses of a larger host, 2 or 3 times as many as we had. They're moving slowly in the snow, but they're on the march. We heard talk that Ramsay's lost some of his sellswords to desertion. They didn't like the cold. But he still has enough." Jarell nodded, her expression grim. "We harried them, killed some, burned a wagon of grain, but there's still plenty left. They're heading here." Jon clenched his fists. "Get some rest. We'll prepare for a siege." Within an hour, the courtyard was organized into stations for the wounded. Tormund settled by a brazier, warming his half-frozen limbs. Jarell took a few Mormont archers to the walls, ready to shoot if Ramsay's men appeared. Davos stood with Jon in the yard, silent as they watched the gates, anticipating the Bolton arrival at any moment. Night fell once more, and still no sign of the enemy. Through the dark hours, Winterfell's defenders dozed in shifts, boots on and weapons close at hand. Jon tried to sleep but found it impossible. He paced the halls, visited the guards, exchanged weary nods with the blacksmith who hammered out last-minute arrowheads. He felt as though an invisible cord tightened around his chest with each passing hour of inaction. It was almost dawn on the second day when a frantic shout rose from the western wall. Men scrambled to their posts, and Jon rushed up the steps 2 at a time. Peering over the parapet, he saw a line of torches flickering in the distance, winding across the snow like a slow-moving serpent. It was the Bolton army at last, their numbers partially obscured by the lingering darkness, but enough that Jon could see hundreds of shapes trudging forward. A shrill horn blew from the lead group, echoing across the open field. The sun began to creep over the horizon, painting the snow in pale orange. As the torches drew nearer, figures came into sharper view. Bolton men wore mismatched armor, though the flayed man banner flew prominently above them. Jon's stomach churned. He could almost see Ramsay's twisted grin in his mind's eye. He noticed a cluster of large shapes moving among the ranks. At first, he thought they might be horses, but as they came closer, he realized they were cages on wheels. Inside them, something moved, impossible to make out from this distance, but it sent an unease rippling across the watchers on the wall. "What in 7 hells?" Tormund muttered, appearing beside Jon. He squinted, trying to discern what was inside the cages. Wolves? Bears? Davos joined them, wincing at the sight. Could be some form of war beast, or men forced to fight on chains. Ramsay's madness knows no bounds. Jon suppressed a shiver. Whatever it is, we'll have to be ready. He turned to the archers. Loose arrows at will once they're in range. Aim for anyone handling those cages. If we can take them out, we might prevent whatever's inside from being unleashed. The archers nodded. Tormund moved along the wall, rousing men's spirits with jests and curses alike. Davos positioned crossbowmen near the gate. Jarell and her Mormont archers settled on the higher ramparts, bows already drawn. As Ramsay's host drew within bowshot, horns sounded from Winterfell. The first volley of arrows soared, arching high before plunging into the enemy ranks. Screams rose, and confusion rippled among the sellswords. Bolton banners swayed, but to Jon's surprise and dismay, the cages remained untouched. Ramsay's men were shielding them with heavy wooden barriers. More arrows rained down, claiming lives on the fringes, but the bulk of the army kept advancing. Then a figure rode forward, detaching from the mass. He came within shouting distance of the walls. Snow coated his black warhorse, and he wore pale furs that made him appear ghost-like in the early morning light. When he raised his head, Jon could see the unmistakable sneer. Ramsay Bolton. He was close enough for his voice to carry, though he had to shout. "Jon Snow, bastard of Ned Stark, have you come to greet me properly?" Jon stepped forward, resting his hands on the cold stone rampart. "You have no place here, Ramsay. Turn back or face the consequences." Ramsay laughed, the sound high and deranged. "Winterfell is mine by right of conquest. My father took it, and now I will reclaim it. Rip it from the hands of traitors and false kings." He gestured to the cages behind him. "I brought a little show for you. Care to watch?" Jon felt a surge of revulsion. "No, go away." Ramsay's grin widened. "Oh, but you'll want to see this." He snapped his fingers. Two men in Bolton livery hurried to the nearest cage, undid a chain, and swung open the door. Out leapt a hulking shape, vaguely wolf-like but larger, bristling with black fur and maddened eyes. It snarled, bounding forward as if unleashed from the pit of hell. A hush of horror fell along the walls. It was a dire wolf, or something that had once been a dire wolf. Patches of fur were missing, revealing raw, wounded flesh. Its mouth gaped in a silent howl, lips curled back over unnaturally long fangs. Around its neck was a collar of jagged metal, studded with cruel spikes. It looked like a tortured beast, starved and crazed. Before Jon could process this atrocity, Ramsay lifted a hand. "Fire!" he shouted. Crossbowmen at the flanks loosed bolts attached to chains. The bolts dug into the poor creature's hide, making it shriek in pain as it was corralled, forced to move forward in front of the Bolton line. Men on the ramparts gasped. Some averted their eyes, disgusted. Jon felt fury flare in his chest. He had seen direwolves only a few times in his life, Ghost being his beloved companion, and those belonging to his siblings. This creature was a mockery of that majestic beast, twisted by Ramsay's cruelty. Ramsay's voice rose, mocking. "You like it, Snow? I found a few in the far north. They didn't last long. This is the only survivor. I thought I'd bring it here for a family reunion." Jon clenched his teeth, his knuckles whitening on the stone. "You're truly mad." Ramsay barked a laugh. "Mad enough to flay every last traitor in this castle unless you open the gates and hand it back to me. Also, I'd quite like your head for what you did to Stannis. That was my kill to take." Jon's rage warred with the necessity of composure. "You want Winterfell? You'll have to fight for it as Stannis did. You'll lose as he did." Another volley of arrows sailed from the walls, but Ramsay was ready, quickly withdrawing behind his men. Some Bolton soldiers fell, but the line trudged closer. Ramsay's crossbowmen loosed their own hail of bolts at the defenders, forcing Jon and the others to duck. A sharp hiss passed by Jon's ear. He heard a cry as one of the men behind him took a bolt to the throat. The siege had begun in earnest. Ramsay's men advanced with crude siege equipment, battering rams, ladders, and tall wooden shields to protect them from arrow fire. That twisted direwolf dragged its chains, forced forward by men who jabbed it with pikes from behind. Its enraged howls reverberated off Winterfell's walls. Jon swallowed hard, shaking off horror. He had to lead. "Archers, focus on the men handling the beast," he shouted. Another volley soared, this time better aimed. Bolton soldiers cried out as arrows found purchase, and one of the crossbow handlers collapsed. The direwolf thrashed wildly, snapping at the chains. Before they could rein it in, it lunged at a nearby soldier and tore into his arm, sending up a spray of blood. Jon allowed himself no flicker of pity for the Bolton man. He seized the moment. More arrows now. A flurry of shafts rained down, thinning the Bolton ranks. Tormund roared encouragement from a nearby tower, while Davos coordinated crossbow fire from the gatehouse. Yet the Bolton host was not easily deterred. They closed ranks, brandishing makeshift shields. A large group surged toward the main gates, dragging a battering ram across the snow. "Oil!" Davos bellowed. Men positioned above the gate tipped cauldrons. Boiling liquid splashed down, and screams erupted as those beneath were scalded. Moments later, archers loosed flaming arrows that ignited the oil, turning the gate approach into an inferno. Bolton soldiers scattered, some ablaze, rolling in the snow. But the momentum of the assault did not cease. Ladders clattered against the walls, and men began climbing. Northern defenders rushed to push them back, stabbing downward with spears, kicking ladders away. The air rang with steel on steel, the screams of the dying, the roar of fire. Jon swept his gaze over the battlements. He saw that a section of the wall near the old library tower was lightly manned. Bolton soldiers had placed a ladder there. He sprinted, Lightbringer in hand, feeling that strange warmth course through him. One of the defenders, a Baratheon knight, had already fallen, leaving only 2 men to repel the climbers. Jon reached the wall's edge just as a Bolton soldier crested the top. He wore a leering mask, and his hands gripped a chipped axe. Jon brought Lightbringer down in a swift strike. The soldier tried to block with his axe, but the Valyrian steel cut through the handle, biting into flesh. The soldier tumbled back with a pained shriek, landing on the men climbing below, sending the ladder toppling. Shouts of alarm rose as the entire column of attackers crashed to the ground. Catching his breath, Jon shouted to the defenders, "Hold this section. Don't let them climb again." He moved on, scanning for another breach. Across the courtyard, he could see the direwolf still chained, dragging 2 men behind it as it snapped and bit. Arrows studded its flank. It was bleeding profusely, yet it refused to die. Ramsay's cruelty had forced it into a rabid state of anguish, and it now lashed out at anything within reach, Bolton or not. In some twisted way, it was assisting Winterfell's defense by sowing chaos among Ramsay's ranks. Jon noticed a cluster of Bolton soldiers breaking off from the main thrust, heading for a smaller side gate. He sprinted along the battlements, calling for reinforcements, but the swirl of battle was thick. Men were engaged everywhere, on the walls, in the yard, over the gatehouse. He realized with growing alarm that the enemy had more men than he could easily repel if they attacked multiple points simultaneously. Sprinting down a flight of wooden steps, he emerged into the courtyard. Several fallen men lay in pools of red slush, steam rising from their wounds in the cold air. The hiss of steel sounded from around a corner. Jon pressed on, rounding the corner to find a group of Bolton soldiers trying to pry open a small postern gate with crowbars. A handful of defenders were engaged with them, but outnumbered. Lightbringer gleamed in Jon's hand. He charged forward, slamming into the nearest Bolton soldier from behind. The man stumbled, turning too late to protect himself. Jon's sword opened his throat, dropping him to the ground. Another soldier whirled, brandishing a spiked mace. Jon ducked as it whistled overhead, then delivered a swift cut across the man's ribs. The Bolton soldier staggered, blood staining the snow. A third man thrust with a short spear. Jon barely twisted aside in time, the spearhead grazing his armor. He retaliated with a diagonal slash. Lightbringer cut deep, severing the soldier's arm. Screaming, the man dropped to his knees. Jon ended his suffering with a quick thrust, wincing at the necessity. The defenders, heartened by Jon's arrival, pressed the remaining Bolton men. They routed, leaving the postern gate still shut. Jon signaled for a pair of archers to guard that area, then dashed back into the courtyard, scanning for the next crisis. His breath came in ragged gulps, each lungful burning in the freezing air. An explosion of activity erupted near the main gates. Ramsay's men, having doused the flames with snow and water, were once again ramming the gates in unison, chanting some barbaric battle cry. The old wooden doors, scorched and cracked from the fire, groaned under the impact. If they broke through, hundreds would flood into the courtyard, and the battle might be lost. Jon hurried toward the gatehouse stairs, heart hammering. On the gatehouse battlements, Davos clung to a vantage point, directing crossbow fire. A scattering of defenders poured arrows down on the attackers at the gate, but the Bolton men used their shields to form a crude shelter. The ram pounded again, timbers splintering. One more hit might breach it. Jon glanced down to see if any more cauldrons of oil or pitch were available. "We need more fire," he shouted at the nearest soldier. "We've used it all," came the panicked reply. As if in answer, Melisandre materialized behind them, her red cloak flapping in the wind. "Give me a torch," she said in a voice that resonated with uncanny power. One soldier handed her a torch, its flame guttering. Melisandre raised the torch high, her ruby pendant blazing suddenly bright. She began to chant in the language of her god. Her voice rose above the din of battle, carrying a strange rhythm that seemed to vibrate in the cold air. Davos watched in wary fascination, crossbow in hand but forgotten. From Jon's vantage, he could see the battered gate, trembling under repeated strikes. Then, as Melisandre's chant reached a crescendo, the flames on the torch shot higher, sparked by some unseen wind. A wave of heat pulsed outward, so strong that Jon felt it on his face. The very air around the gates shimmered. Suddenly, the gate erupted in a burst of flame, an inferno more intense than any ordinary fire. The battering ram, the shields, and the men holding them were instantly engulfed. A deafening roar filled the courtyard, accompanied by the screams of dying men. Flames licked at the timbers with a ravenous appetite, climbing higher than the earlier oil fires. Jon stared in shock. He had seen Melisandre conjure illusions, birth a shadow, but never this raw power. The men at the gate scattered, some ablaze, others simply overwhelmed by the heat. The ram fell with a clatter, burning fiercely. The gate itself, ironically, was also consumed, the old wood turning to ash in moments. Ramsay's men recoiled from the flames, uncertain whether to charge through the molten wreckage or flee. Some tried to scramble away, only to be cut down by arrows from the walls. Smoke billowed thick and acrid, mixing with the swirling snow. The inferno blocked direct entry, but once it burned itself out, a large hole gaped in the gate's remnants, offering a possible path inside. Jon whirled to Melisandre, eyes widening. "You've weakened the gate further." She turned her gaze on him, her face contorted with an almost rapturous intensity. "I have given you more time. Now the Bolton men must cross fire to get in, and that may halt them." She closed her eyes, swaying slightly as if drained. Victory will come at a cost. Below, some of Ramsay's men rushed forward despite the flames, hoping to gain entry while defenders were distracted. They leapt over the charred wreckage, only to find themselves in a blazing patch of ground. Several collapsed, screaming as their garments ignited. Others turned and fled. Jon grit his teeth. The gate was indeed open now, if partially blocked by fire. If the flames died down, Ramsay's men could charge in unimpeded. "We have to station men in the courtyard to hold that gap," he said to Davos. "We can't rely on the fire alone." Davos agreed, barking commands to gather a contingent of spearmen. Jon nodded at Melisandre, uncertain whether to thank her or curse her. She had saved them momentarily, but also risked turning the gate into a path for their enemies. She merely lowered her head and withdrew, the torch extinguished, the ruby at her throat dimming to a faint glow. Ramsay's horns sounded again. Through the smoke, Jon glimpsed the bastard himself, mounted on his black steed, shouting commands. He gestured at the burning gate, and waves of soldiers began regrouping, as if preparing another assault. The chained direwolf still prowled the perimeter, half embedded with arrows, frothing at the mouth. Jon felt a surge of pity for the creature, an innocent twisted into a weapon. Then, in a moment that made Jon's heart lurch, a fresh wave of Bolton soldiers advanced behind heavy shields, spraying crossbow bolts at the defenders on the walls. Jon ducked, hearing bolts clatter off stone. One found a mark, driving a man's corpse over the parapet. Another soldier fell beside Jon, a bolt piercing his neck. Blood spattered across the stone. The rest of the Bolton men charged the gap in the gate. Fire licked at them, but some braved it, stepping over the charred remains of their comrades. Winterfell's courtyard erupted into chaos as defenders rushed to meet them. Screams, steel, and the stench of burning flesh mingled in a nightmarish symphony. Jon scrambled down the steps, Lightbringer in hand, determined to stop the flood of enemies from overrunning the courtyard. He heard Tormund's war cry from somewhere ahead. A swirl of snow and smoke obscured his vision, but he pressed on, guided by the clash of steel and the silhouette of rampaging figures. He reached the ground level just in time to see a group of Bolton soldiers driving back a handful of free folk. Bodies lay strewn about, and blood stained the snow. Jon let out a feral shout, charging into the melee. His sword, wreathed in some intangible warmth, cut a path through the confusion. A Bolton man fell to his strike, howling as the Valyrian steel bit deep. Another turned, raising a mace. Jon dodged, slashing across the man's torso. A third soldier advanced, shield raised, but Jon hooked his blade around it and slammed into the man, toppling him onto his back. A swift thrust ended it. Back to the gate, Jon roared to the defenders, rallying them to hold the breach. Tormund appeared at his side, his face streaked with soot and blood, an axe in each hand. He split the skull of a Bolton man who ventured too close, then slammed a shoulder into another, sending him reeling. "We're losing ground." Tormund shouted over the din, "They keep coming." Jon knew he was right. Despite their bravest efforts, more and more Bolton men poured through the charred gateway. They threatened to fan out across the courtyard, outflanking the defenders. If that happened, Winterfell, would be lost. He shouted for more men, and Davos arrived with a ragged line of spearmen. They clashed with the attackers, blocking their advance for the moment. But with every passing second, the scale of bloodshed increased. Then, through the billowing smoke, Jon saw Ramsay himself urging his mount into the courtyard. The black warhorse snorted, stepping over corpses. Ramsay's pale face was twisted in savage glee. Jon's anger soared to a furious peak. He had to end this, cut off the snake's head. "Ramsay Bolton!" Jon roared, forcing his way forward. He parried a spear thrust from a Bolton soldier, then dispatched the man with a brutal riposte. Another soldier came at him from the left, only to be felled by Tormund's axe. The swirl of battle parted momentarily, revealing Ramsay glaring at Jon with malevolent delight. Jon broke into a run, Lightbringer raised. Ramsay smirked, swinging his leg over to dismount and face Jon on equal ground. He drew 2 daggers, each wickedly curved. Around them, men fought and died, screams echoing off the high walls. Snow and ashes fell from the sky, creating a hellish tableau. "Come, bastard," Ramsay taunted, flicking one dagger in a mocking salute. "Let's see if you can kill me like you killed Stannis. Or do you prefer to murder men in the dark?" Jon's grip on Lightbringer tightened. He remembered the direwolf, the villages Ramsay had burned, the flayed corpses. He would end this. "You deserve nothing less," Jon spat, stepping closer. They closed the distance. Ramsay lunged, daggers flickering, seeking gaps in Jon's armor. Jon pivoted, managing to deflect one blade with Lightbringer, but the other came dangerously close to his side. He twisted, feeling the dagger's tip scrape across his cuirass, leaving a shallow dent. Ramsay laughed, eyes glittering with sadistic amusement. "Nice sword. Do you think it will save you from me?" He struck again, a barrage of swift, slashing attacks that forced Jon to retreat a step. Lightbringer clanged against steel, and sparks flew. Jon gritted his teeth, letting his training take over. He had once been taught by Syrio Farrell's style through Arya's recollections, light, quick footwork, and had sparred countless times with the men of the Night's Watch. He found a rhythm, parrying and sidestepping, searching for an opening. Ramsay's grin never wavered. "I made a coat from Theon Greyjoy's skin. He was a Stark prisoner once. Would you like to be next?" He feinted with the right dagger, then cut in with the left, slicing a shallow wound across Jon's upper arm. Pain flared, but Jon kept his focus. He ignored Ramsay's taunts and the throbbing cut, pressing forward with a relentless assault. Lightbringer was heavier than a dagger, but had more reach. He forced Ramsay to dodge back. With each swing, the sword glowed faintly, as if reacting to Jon's fury. Ramsay's eyes flicked to it in momentary apprehension. Taking advantage, Jon slammed the blade into Ramsay's right dagger, knocking it aside. He swung in a powerful arc at Ramsay's torso. Ramsay leapt back, stumbling over a corpse. He lost his balance, and Jon seized the chance to thrust. Ramsay twisted desperately, taking the blow on his left dagger. The force knocked the weapon from his hand. He fell onto his back in the snow, looking up at Jon with a mix of rage and fear. Still, his grin persisted, like a cornered animal baring its teeth. Jon stood over him, panting, Lightbringer raised. All around them, men fought and died, but in Jon's vision, it was as if the world narrowed to just him and Ramsay. This was the moment to end the bastard of Bolton, to free the North from his cruelty. Ramsay spat blood, dragging himself backward in the slush. "Go on, do it. Kill me like you killed your precious king. You're a murderer just like me." Jon trembled. Rage and revulsion churned in his gut. He remembered the oath he had broken to end Stannis' reign of terror. Was this any different, or was it justice? He saw images of flayed men, the dead Glover soldiers, the tortured direwolf. Yes, he told himself, this was justice. He gripped Lightbringer with both hands, preparing for a final, decisive thrust. Ramsay let out a shrill giggle, a maniac's last defiance. The blade hovered inches from Ramsay's throat. But at that exact moment, something slammed into Jon's side with brute force. He crashed into the snow, Lightbringer flying from his grip. He rolled, gasping for air, and looked up to see the wounded direwolf, freed from its chain somehow, bounding over the battlefield. It had battered into Jon accidentally. Now it turned, savage eyes alighting on Ramsay, who scrambled to his feet. Ramsay's grin vanished in an instant as the monstrous beast snarled, foam flecking its jaws. The Bolton bastard tried to bolt, but the direwolf lunged, jaws closing over his arm. A piercing scream tore from Ramsay's throat. Jon pushed himself up, reeling from the impact. He glimpsed the direwolf thrashing Ramsay about like a rag doll, ignoring his frantic attempts to stab at the creature's face with his single remaining dagger. Blood spattered in crimson arcs across the snow. The beast's muzzle curled in a frenzied fury that no amount of cruelty could have matched. Ramsay's screams rose, shrill and desperate. Horrified, Jon realized the direwolf was beyond saving, beyond reason. It had been tortured, starved, driven mad. Now it exacted its revenge on the one who enslaved it. Despite everything Ramsay had done, the sight churned Jon's stomach, yet he did not move to interfere. Perhaps no mortal interference could have stopped that savage, unstoppable force. The screams died away, replaced by the direwolf's ragged snarls. Then the beast sank, exhausted, blood pouring from its numerous wounds. It collapsed atop what remained of Ramsay Bolton, a twisted heap of gore. Slowly, the direwolf's breathing ceased, its final ragged breath steaming in the icy air. Jon stared, numb, uncertain whether to feel relief, horror, or something else entirely. He forced himself to stand, retrieving Lightbringer from the snow. He looked around and saw that the Bolton assault was faltering. Leaderless, many cells' words had broken ranks, fleeing the burning gate. Others still fought fiercely in small knots, but without Ramsay driving them, their resolve wavered. Winterfell's defenders gained ground. Tormund, limping from a gash in his leg, made his way over to Jon, panting. Did you kill him?" Jon's voice came out hoarse. "The dire wolf did." Tormund followed Jon's gaze, grimacing at the sight. Fitting, they shared a silent moment, then turned to see the rest of the battle. Davos led a charge of spearmen that cut down the last cluster of Bolton diehards near the courtyard well. A few fled, only to be brought down by arrows from the walls. The battered, smoking gate area was strewn with bodies. Everywhere Jon looked, men knelt in surrender or lay unmoving in the snow. The siege was broken. Jon's chest heaved with exertion and sorrow. He had wanted to bring Ramsay to justice with his own hand, but perhaps this ending was more poetic. A dire wolf, the symbol of House Stark, avenging its tormentor. Now the courtyard was eerily quiet, except for the crackling of residual flames and the groans of the dying. Davos approached, crossbow in hand, hair matted with soot. "We've won," he said in disbelief. "They're routing or surrendering." Jon nodded, hardly able to form words. Tormund spat on the ground, wincing from his wound. We've won, but at what cost?" They surveyed the carnage. Hundreds of corpses, many of them defenders. Smoke rose in oily plumes from the gate. The walls blackened with scorch marks. Yet Winterfell stood. The flayed man banners that had accompanied Ramsay's army now lay trampled in the snow. No more would Ramsay Bolton haunt the north. Slowly, men began to cheer, voices raw with exhaustion and relief. The sound built upon itself, growing into a triumphant roar, echoing through the shattered courtyard. For a brief moment, the living clung to the elation of survival. Jon allowed himself a moment of weary satisfaction. Stannis was gone. Ramsay was gone. The Boltons were finished. The North was free, at least from that threat. But the memory of the White Walkers loomed in his mind, an even greater danger waiting in the darkness beyond the wall. And he was not certain how many more battles they could endure before that final storm fell upon them. He wiped blood from his face, gazing at the courtyard's tangle of the dead. "Secure the prisoners," he told Davos. "Gather the wounded. Give mercy to those beyond saving. We'll gather the bodies in the yard. No one gets flayed, no one gets tortured. We do this honorably." Davos nodded. "As you command, my king." Jon stared at the grim tableau. King. He felt no sense of glory, only the bitter taste of duty. That was the mantle he had taken, and so far it was soaked in blood. Yet the cheers rang on, men chanting "Stark" and "King in the North" in an impromptu chorus. Some knelt in the snow, praising him for freeing them from the Bolton terror. He found little solace in that praise. Victory here was just one piece of a far larger puzzle. If they could not muster the North to face the others, all of this would be but a tragic footnote, a last gasp of mortal squabbles before the cold darkness devoured them all. Still clutching Lightbringer, Jon Snow, Jon Stark, turned toward the ruin of the gate, where night's shadows and dawn's uncertain light mingled. Smoke drifted around him, and blood stained his furs. Whatever else the day might bring, Ramsay Bolton's threat was ended. The cost had been high, but it was done. He closed his eyes, feeling the slight hum of warmth in the sword at his side. Melisandre's words echoed in his mind. "You will do what must be done." And so he would, even if it meant waging war after war, sacrifice after sacrifice, until the final enemy was laid to rest. Because there was no one else to bear this burden. In the hush that followed, all Jon could think was that the North was free from one terror, and had survived another day. Yet winter still raged, and the dead still marched beyond the horizon. They would need every ounce of strength, every ally they could find, and the unbreakable will of the North if they stood any chance of surviving the storms yet to come.